gold, cross, and empire. Long before Spain emerged as a unified kingdom, the Iberian Peninsula echoed with the clash of cultures. Christians battling Muslim Taifa states, Vikings raiding Atlantic coasts, and wealthy Mediterranean merchants plying their trade in Catalonia and Galicia. Over 7 centuries, from the early 8th to the late 15th century, that rugged land forged an identity in blood and faith. The Reconquista, a rolling campaign to reclaim territory held by Muslim rulers. In 1492, as Christian armies under Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile finally wrested Granada, a new chapter dawned, one that would see Spain transform from a frontier realm into the first truly global empire. This empire was propelled by 3 interlocking forces: gold, cross, and empire. Gold, the lustrous promise of wealth drawn from the bowels of the New World, beneath Andean peaks and Caribbean sands. Cross, the religious zeal of Christian Spain, determined to spread Catholicism beyond Europe's borders and earn spiritual merit in the eyes of Rome. Empire, a political ambition to extend Spain's power across oceans, establish ports and presidios, from Mexico to Manila, and craft a network of colonies so vast that the sun never set upon its domains. The quest for gold began almost immediately after Columbus's 1492 landfall. News of cannibalistic natives and ebony forests soon gave way to reports of riverbanks glittering with dust and nuggets, tales so fantastical that upon their return, Alonso de Ojeda and Hernán Cortés steered their own caravels westward in search of Indian wealth. As conquistadors toppled the mighty Aztec and Inca empires, they uncovered unimaginable silver deposits at Potosí and rich veins of gold in New Spain. That silver, transported in navios de regreso across the Pacific to Manila and across the Atlantic via the treasure fleets to Seville, funded Spain's wars in Europe and fueled inflation that reverberated from Antwerp to Lisbon. Simultaneously, the spread of Christianity underpinned Spain's imperial mission. Each ship carried not only arquebuses and horses, but also Dominican friars, Franciscan missionaries, and Jesuit priests, tasked with baptizing native peoples, establishing missions, and constructing churches that blended Gothic arches with indigenous motifs. The church's role was twofold: to save souls and to rationalize conquest, casting Spain's expansion as a holy enterprise approved by the papacy in the Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494. That treaty, negotiated by Pope Alexander VI, drew an imaginary meridian across the globe, granting westward lands to Spain and eastward ones to Portugal, cementing the Spanish crown's spiritual and temporal authority. Together, these drives, rapacity for gold, zeal for the cross, and hunger for empire, made Spain the first modern global empire. Its domains spanned 4 continents, from the fortress town of Cadiz in Europe to the Caribbean islands, the Aztec heartland, the Andean highlands, the Philippine archipelago, and even footholds on the African coast. A network of viceroyalties, audiencias, and missions administered these far-flung territories, while the Casa de Contratación in Seville regulated trade, shipping, and legal matters for all New World commerce. This journey from Reconquista frontier to global empire was neither smooth nor unambiguous. It was marked by breathtaking triumphs and terrible cruelties, battles in dense jungles, famines in frontier settlements, epidemics that decimated indigenous populations, and rebellions that occasionally forced Spanish authorities to retreat or reform. Yet through each trial, Spain adapted, reorganizing its colonial administration, codifying laws like the laws of the Indies, and fostering a unique Hispanic culture that blended Castilian, Aztec, Mayan, Quechua, and Tagalog elements. Ahead lies a chronicle of that extraordinary era. Its origins in the Iberian Wars, its first transatlantic voyages, the epic conquests of Cortés and Pizarro, the rise of silver fleets and artistic golden ages, the fierce contests with rival European powers, the gradual decline and Bourbon reforms, and finally, the revolutions that fractured the empire into independent nations. In tracing this path, we will meet queens and conquistadors, priests and merchants, slaves and free peoples, each playing a part in a grand narrative of ambition, faith, and transformation. So, settle in and let the story of gold, cross, and empire unfold, from the sun-drenched palaces of Toledo to the misty heights of Machu Picchu, from the coral reefs of the Caribbean to the bustling docks of Manila, from the parchment-inked decrees of colonial officials to the whispered prayers of indigenous converts. In understanding how Spain built and ultimately relinquished its empire, we illuminate not only the past of distant lands, but the origins of much that shapes our modern world. Language, religion, legal traditions, and the ever-shifting currents of cultural encounter. The voyage is about to begin. The Reconquista and birth of empire. Long before Spanish ships crossed the Atlantic, the land that would become Spain was itself a frontier, an arena of nearly continuous conflict and cultural exchange between Christian and Muslim kingdoms. Beginning in 711 CE, when Berber and Arab forces swept across the Strait of Gibraltar and quickly overran the Visigothic kingdom, the Reconquista unfolded over 7 centuries. It was a war of attrition and imagination, a rolling campaign in which Christian rulers of the northern uplands, Asturias, Leon, Castile, Navarre, Aragon, and later Portugal, fought to reclaim territory and reforge their identity. At first, the Christian resistance was fragile. In the mountains of Asturias, a small Visigothic rump under Pelagius won a famous victory at Covadonga, circa 722, offering hope that the invaders could be held at bay. Over the next 2 centuries, kingdoms rose and fell. The kingdom of Leon emerged, Castile broke away under Count Fernand González, and Navarre maintained a precarious independence. Christian chronicles framed the conflict in stark religious terms, plotted as a divine quest to reconquer lands stolen by infidels. Yet many episodes were collaborations, truces, and alliances that cut across faith. Christian lords employing Muslim mercenaries, Muslim taifas paying tribute, pariahs to Christian kings, intermarriage among noble houses, and shared cultural flourishes in art and learning under Almoravid and Almohad rule. The high point of Muslim power in Iberia occurred under the Caliphate of Córdoba, 929 to 1031. which presided over a flourishing civilization of mosques, libraries, and palaces. Christian forces could not directly challenge Córdoba's domain, so they instead consolidated the northern Christian realms, developing more centralized administrations, forging feudal bonds with knights, and repopulating frontier zones, known as repartimiento, with settlers who implanted new agricultural practices. These frontier marches, Extremadura, Murcia, Valencia, became laboratories of social experimentation, where legal codes blended Roman, Germanic, and Islamic traditions. The 11th and 12th centuries saw the fracturing of Al-Andalus into smaller taifas and the arrival of North African dynasties, the Almoravids and then the Almohads, to shore up Islamic rule. Battles like Sagrajas, 1086, and Alarcos, 1195, checked Christian advances, but ultimately proved temporary. By the mid-13th century, Christian kings, now more powerful and united, captured Córdoba, 1236, under Ferdinand III of Castile and Seville, 1248, eroding Muslim rule on the peninsula. Granada remained the last taifa, its rulers paying tribute, pariahs, to Castilian monarchs, while preserving a dazzling culture centered on the Alhambra. This long struggle forged the political and religious solidity that would propel Spain onto the world stage. By the late 15th century, two dynasties, Castile under the Trastámaras and Aragon under the House of Barcelona, found themselves aligned by marriage, politics, and common purpose. In 1469, the marriage of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon united two of the peninsula's most powerful crowns. Though each retained its own laws, institutions, and customs, the Ferdinand and Isabella partnership, later styled the Catholic monarchs, created a dynastic union strong enough to achieve the Reconquista's final act. In January 1492, the strategic port city of Granada, the nebulous kingdom led by Sultan Boabdil, fell after a long siege. The Alhambra surrender embodied the culmination of centuries of conflict, its defenders allowed to leave peacefully, but with the condition of conversion or exile. Within months, the Alhambra decree ordered the expulsion, or forced conversion, of Jews, imposing religious uniformity in Castile and Aragon. While later monarchs relaxed these edicts, the Catholic monarch's emphasis on religious unity, cemented by the power of the Spanish Inquisition, laid the groundwork for Spain's later imperial enterprises, in which Catholicism would serve as both justification and instrument of rule. Thus, the Reconquista was more than a military campaign. It was a profound crucible of identity formation. Spanish rulers learned to coordinate cross-regional armies, negotiate alliances with foreign powers, administer diverse populations, and employ religious institutions, skills that would prove invaluable on the high seas. The capture of Granada freed Spain's leaders to look beyond Iberia's shores. In the very year that Moorish banners were lowered, Christopher Columbus prepared his fleet to sail west, sponsored by Isabella's treasury and Ferdinand's strategic vision. With the Reconquista at last complete, Spain's energies would shift outward, embarking on an age of exploration that would connect Europe to the Americas, Asia, and Africa, ushering in the first global empire powered by the same dynastic union forged in Granada's gates. In that sense, the Reconquista was not an end, but the beginning of Spain's transformation from a frontier kingdom to a world-spanning empire. In the waning days of January 1492, after nearly 8 centuries of intermittent warfare, diplomacy, and cultural exchange, the last Muslim stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula surrendered. Granada falls in 1492, marking the definitive end of the Reconquista and ushering in a new era for Spain, an era in which the energies once devoted to internal conflict would be poured into global exploration and empire. The sluice gates of history opened when, on January 2nd, the Nasrid Sultanate of Granada capitulated. Muhammad XIII, known to Christians as Boabdil, rode out of the Alhambra's gates in a somber procession, turning once to gaze upon the city he had lost. In accordance with the surrender of Granada Treaty, the Christian conquerors under Ferdinand and Isabella guaranteed freedom of worship, protection of property, and respect for existing laws for Granada's Muslim inhabitants. Yet within months, these promises eroded. The Alhambra Decree of March 31st, 1492, expelled Jews from Castile and Aragon, and subsequent policies pressured Muslims to convert or leave. Thus, the multicultural convivencia that had defined parts of medieval Spain gave way to religious homogeneity. Under the banner of Catholic orthodoxy, Granada's fall carried immense symbolic weight. It demonstrated the effectiveness of modernized warfare, Castile's artillery and disciplined infantry, against the fortified red walls of the Alhambra. It legitimized the authority of the newly united crowns, who now styled themselves the Catholic monarchs, defenders of the faith. And perhaps most importantly, it freed both monarchs from the pressing demands of domestic warfare, allowing them to pursue more ambitious ventures beyond Europe's shores. Indeed, even before Granada's fall, Ferdinand and Isabella had already granted Christopher Columbus the patronage to seek a westward route to Asia. Columbus had languished in Portuguese courts after his Portuguese interlocutors deemed his calculations too optimistic. But by the late 1480s, the Catholic monarchs, eager to outflank Portuguese dominance along the African coast, found Columbus's proposal appealing. They calculated that any such expedition, successful or not, would burnish Spain's prestige and perhaps yield new opportunities for trade, tribute, or conquest. With Granada secured, resources once reserved for the war effort were redirected to navigation, shipbuilding, and outfitting voyages. In April 1492, Columbus left Palos de la Frontera with 3 ships, the Niña, Pinta, and Santa Maria, and a multinational crew of mariners. The Crown provided letters patent, promising Columbus governorship and a percentage of any wealth discovered. His departure coincided almost to the day with the last Moorish surrender. Within weeks of Granada's fall, Spain had launched its first footsteps into the uncharted waters of the Atlantic. This redirection of focus, from recapturing the Iberian hills to probing the ocean's horizons, represented a profound shift in Spanish policy. Instead of defending against incursions, the monarchs now sponsored expeditions that sought both knowledge and profit. Men like Juan de la Cosa, Rodrigo de Triana, and Pedro Alonso Niño would sail under the Spanish banner, mapping Caribbean coasts, forging the first settlement at La Navidad on Hispaniola, and laying the groundwork for what would become a vast colonial network. Even as Columbus's 1492-93 voyage returned with parrots, gold dust, and accounts of native peoples, Ferdinand and Isabella sought to regulate the new enterprise. In 1493, they established the Casa de Contratación, House of Trade, in Seville to oversee all voyages to the New World. The Casa managed licensing, collected taxes on cargoes, and maintained the Padrón Real, the official Spanish chart used by naval pilots. These administrative innovations mirrored the centralized governance that had enabled the successful conclusion of the Reconquista and would prove crucial in sustaining a global empire. Within a generation of Granada's fall, Spain had charted more of the Atlantic coastline than any European power. In 1493, Columbus embarked on a second voyage with 17 ships and over 1,000 settlers, establishing Isabella on Hispaniola and extending Spanish influence to Puerto Rico. In 1498, on his third voyage, Columbus reached the South American mainland. By 1502, explorers like Vasco Núñez de Balboa crossed the Isthmus of Panama to glimpse the Pacific Ocean, realizing that the new lands were not Asia, but an entirely separate continent. These bold ventures were underwritten by the very unity and military capacity forged during the Reconquista. The same logistical networks that supported sieges at Ronda and Malaga now supplied caravels at Cadiz and Cartagena. Noble families who had gained lands in Andalusia and Valencia turned their energies to colonial enterprises, investing in ships and labor. Veterans of frontier warfare, seasoned in cavalry tactics and skirmishes, became conquistadors, applying their martial skills to the conquest of indigenous polities in the Americas. Thus, the fall of Granada in 1492 did more than end centuries of peninsular conflict. It signaled Spain's transformation into a maritime power with global ambitions. Freed from internal wars, the Catholic monarchs channeled their resources into charting new worlds, driven by the intertwined goals of gold, cross an empire. As the banners of Spain flew over distant islands, mainland settlements, and tropical presidios, the Reconquista's legacy endured in administrative prowess and religious zeal, yet now powered an age of exploration that would reshape human history on every inhabited continent. The Reconquista had concluded. The age of empire had truly begun. 92 and beyond, Columbus and the New World. In August of 1492, the wooden hulls of 3 ships, Santa Maria, Pinta, and Niña, creaked as they slipped out of the Spanish port of Palos de la Frontera. Beneath their sails, a small crew of about 90 men, sailors, carpenters, and a few gentlemen adventurers, felt the same mixture of hope and trepidation that has accompanied every great voyage of discovery. Commanding these vessels was Christopher Columbus, a Genoese mariner whose persistence had finally convinced King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella of Spain to underwrite his plan to reach Asia by sailing westward across the uncharted Atlantic. Though his calculations underestimated Earth's circumference, Columbus's bold proposal held a lure for Spanish royalty, eager to outpace Portuguese rivals and uncover new sources of wealth and souls to convert to Christianity. From the moment Columbus set sail, the voyage was a test of endurance and faith. Rains lashed the decks as they rounded Cape St. Vincent, and mistrust simmered among the crew, who feared the ocean never ended. Supplies of salt pork and hardtack dwindled. Men grew sick of sea biscuits and pepper-infused wine. Yet guided by the North Star and aided by the winds of the trade, the expedition pressed on. For weeks, only the monotony of deep blue horizon accompanied them. Endless water under an endless sky. Columbus paced the quarterdeck, fingers tracing the compass rose, convinced that imminent landfall awaited. When at last the lookouts cried, "Land, land!" on the pre-dawn of October 12, 1492, relief rippled through the fleet. They had sighted a low-lying island with palms swaying in the gentle breeze. Columbus named it San Salvador, though the Lucayan Taino who lived there called it Guanahani. He believed he had reached the eastern fringes of Asia, perhaps the islands off China or Japan. Instead, he and his men had set foot on the shores of a previously unknown continent, the first Europeans to do so in over a millennium. The first contact with Caribbean islands unfolded with a mix of wonder, cautious hospitality, and inevitability of exploitation. The Taino inhabitants greeted these pale-skinned newcomers with open arms, offering fresh fruits, cherimoyas, guavas, and sweet potatoes, and guiding Columbus through reefs and channels in their canoes. Their villages, clustered along sandy beaches, were built of wooden posts and palm-thatched roofs. Columbus marveled at the natives' gentle manners and reported in his journal that they possessed no iron, arrowheads fashioned instead from stone, yet showed curiosity in European goods, glass beads, hawk's bells, and brightly woven cloth. Eager to secure provisions and assert Spain's claim, Columbus dispatched landing parties to explore neighboring islands. Within days he encountered Cuba, whom he christened Juana, and Hispaniola, which would become the hub of Spanish colonial activity. On these islands, Columbus established the first foothold of empire, La Navidad, a makeshift settlement, on Hispaniola, where the Santa Maria had run aground. Leaving behind a small contingent to search for gold and perhaps serve as Spain's initial colonists, he turned the flagship's timbers into a crude fortification. This act, erecting crosses and claiming territory in the name of Ferdinand and Isabella, signaled the beginning of Spain's imperial presence in the Americas. Columbus's reports back to Spain spoke of vast potential: golden rivers, fertile soils, and countless souls waiting for conversion. Yet his letters also acknowledged challenges: tropical storms, unfamiliar diseases, and the delicate need to maintain peaceful relations with the Taino. Within months of initial contact, however, these relationships would fray. The demands of the settlers for labor and tribute under Spain's nascent encomienda system began to disrupt indigenous lifeways. Taino communities were compelled to mine for gold pannage or produce agricultural surplus, and those who resisted faced violence or enslavement. Diseases such as smallpox and influenza, new to the New World, ravaged populations with catastrophic mortality rates. Nevertheless, Columbus's voyages ignited a tidal wave of exploration. In 1493, he set sail again with 17 ships and more than 1,000 settlers, further mapping the Caribbean, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and the Lesser Antilles, and solidifying Spain's territorial claims. These early encounters, rooted in mutual curiosity and soon marred by conquest, laid the foundation for the vast Spanish Empire that would stretch from the Florida Keys to the Pacific shores of Panama, from the windswept Andes to the archipelago of the Philippines. As we settle into this new chapter of history, we recognize that Columbus's 1492 landing was not merely a ship's arrival, but the opening of a transoceanic doorway. It set in motion centuries of cultural exchange, demographic upheaval, and geopolitical transformation. From the moment Columbus raised his cross and unfurled Spain's banner on Guanahani's beach, the world's contours shifted irrevocably. In the pages to come, we will trace how that initial voyage evolved into a centuries-long saga of conquest, colonization, resistance, and cultural fusion, an odyssey of gold cross and empire that reshaped human civilization on a global scale. Within months of Christopher Columbus's first landfall in October 1492, Spain's nascent empire established its first early settlements on the islands that would become the keystones of colonial expansion: Hispaniola, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. Each possession presented unique geographies, resources, and indigenous cultures, setting the stage for Spain's long and often tragic encounter with the peoples of the New World. Hispaniola, today divided between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, was the location of Spain's very first colonial foothold. After the Santa Maria ran aground on Christmas Day 1492, Columbus ordered its timbers repurposed into a small fort he named La Navidad. This makeshift stockade, nestled on the northern coast, housed some 40 men left behind to secure Spain's claim and to search for gold. These early settlers struggled with inadequate food supplies, unfamiliar tropical diseases, and growing tensions with the local Taíno population. Finding La Navidad in ruins on his return voyage in late 1493, Columbus quickly established a new base, La Isabela, on Hispaniola's northern shore. Though short-lived, La Isabela served as a model, a central plaza with a church, quarters for soldiers, workshops for carpenters and blacksmiths, and storage facilities for food and mining equipment. From this embryonic town, Columbus mounted expeditions inland, hoping to unearth the precious metals that would finance Spain's global ambitions. Just a few weeks after La Navidad's founding, Columbus's ships probed the southern shores of Cuba, believing they had reached Asia's outlying islands. He named the region Juana, after Princess Joanna of Castile, and installed a garrison led by Father Bartolomé de las Casas, a Dominican friar who would later champion indigenous rights. The Spanish explored Cuba's verdant plains, establishing temporary camps as they sought a northwest passage to China. However, Columbus's men found little gold and faced stiff resistance from the Ciboney and Taíno groups who inhabited the island. The rough terrain, swamps, mangroves, and dense forests hampered settlement. Cuba's significance grew slowly, becoming a cornerstone of Spain's Caribbean network only after Diego Velázquez de Cuellar formally established Baracoa in 1511 and later founded Santiago de Cuba. From there, Spanish expeditions launched conquests of mainland Mexico and Central America, using Cuban ports as supply bases and staging grounds. In late 1493, Columbus's second voyage reached the island he called San Juan Bautista, modern Puerto Rico, named in honor of John the Baptist. He claimed the land for Spain and dispatched a small company of men to explore its bays and rivers. Yet serious settlement did not begin until the governorship of Juan Ponce de Leon in 1508. Landing at Capara, near present-day San Juan, Ponce de Leon quickly noted Puerto Rico's fertile lands and strategic harbors. He began organizing the Chay de Island under Spanish colonial law, awarding encomiendas, grants of land and labor rights over indigenous groups, to veterans of the conquest, constructing a rudimentary fortress and initiating the cultivation of crops such as yucca, sugar cane, and cotton. San Juan served as a critical defensive bulwark against foreign powers and pirate raids, maturing into Spain's military and administrative hub in the Caribbean. Across Hispaniola, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, Spain's earliest settlers engaged with diverse indigenous societies, each with complex social structures, spiritual beliefs, and agricultural systems. On Hispaniola, the Taíno had established a matrilineal chiefdom structure governed by caciques, chiefs, cultivating maize, cassava, and tobacco. Their villages featured canucos, raised planting mounds, and bohíos, circular thatched homes. Columbus's men observed the Taínos' metal-free culture, stone tools, wooden bowls, cotton hammocks, and noted their generosity in trade, gold trinkets in exchange for glass beads and hawks' bells. However, misunderstandings and exploitation quickly soured relations. The Spaniards imposed tributes of gold dust and forced labor under the encomienda, tearing families from their communal lands. Resistance took forms from evasive flight into mountainous interiors to outright rebellion. In Hispaniola's interior, the Taínos of Jaragua and Magua revolted repeatedly until brutally suppressed in the mid-1490s. Epidemics, smallpox, influenza, measles, introduced by Europeans, decimated indigenous populations who lacked immunity, causing mortality rates estimated between 50% and 90% within decades. In Cuba, early Spanish chroniclers like Diego de Velázquez recorded the Siboney and Guajiro peoples practicing shamanic rituals in Caney, polished wooden buildings, and playing Beatty ritual ball games. Initial peaceful exchanges gave way to kidnappings and forced relocation as settlers sought labor. Many indigenous groups retreated to inaccessible regions, the Sierra Maestra or Pinar del Rio, carving out enclaves of resistance that endured. For generations, Puerto Rico's Taíno, known for sophisticated canoe navigation and worship of zemis, ancestral spirits represented by sculpted figures, also faced displacement. Ponce de Leon's settlements disrupted their agricultural cycles. By 1514, the Taíno presence in coastal valleys had dwindled, replaced by Spanish ranches and plantations. Survivors merged into African slave labor on sugar estates, erasing indigenous cultural continuities. These early encounters established defining patterns of Spanish colonization. Missionary zeal to convert indigenous peoples, Dominicans and Franciscans baptized thousands, economic extraction through encomiendas, and military enforcement to quell resistance. Yet they also produced syncretic cultural forms, Catholic saints melding with Taíno deities, European livestock integrated into Caribbean ecosystems, and African rhythms brought by enslaved labor, blending with indigenous music traditions in later centuries. By the close of the 16th century, the initial settlements on Hispaniola, Cuba, and Puerto Rico had flourished into thriving colonial societies. Towns laid out in grid plans around central plazas, economies pivoting from subsistence to cash crops, and fortresses guarding against rival European navies. These islands became the heart of Spain's New World Empire, a network of supply bases, administrative centers, and missionary outposts that sustained further expansions into Mexico, Central America, and South America. The Golden Cross that propelled Spain's Reconquista now fueled a global venture linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a transformative web of commerce, culture, and conquest. Conquistadors, Cortés, Pizarro, and empire in the Americas. In 1519, a small band of Spaniards led by Hernán Cortés set sail from Cuba with a contingent of 600 men, a handful of horses, and a determination to secure wealth and glory for Spain. Cortés, born in Medellin in Extremadura, was not content to remain under the command of Governor Diego Velázquez. He defied orders and pressed on to the Mexican mainland, believing that the legendary riches of the Aztec Empire lay beyond the horizon. Landing on the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula, he founded the town of Veracruz, claiming its inhabitants for Castile and effectively establishing his own legal authority, an act that nullified any attempt by Velázquez to recall him. From Veracruz, Cortés moved inland, forging alliances with indigenous groups long resentful of Aztec domination, particularly the Totonacs, Tlaxcalans, and Huejotzincas. These alliances proved decisive. By the time Cortés reached Tenochtitlan, the sprawling island capital built on Lake Texcoco, he commanded not only his original Spaniards and African slaves, but also tens of thousands of native auxiliaries. In November 1519, he entered Tenochtitlan and was received by Emperor Moctezuma II, who, according to some accounts, believed Cortés to be the returning deity Quetzalcoatl. During the ensuing months, relations soured as Cortés arrested Moctezuma and his captains, seeking control of the city's gold stores. In the spring of 1520, news of a Spanish expedition sent to arrest Cortés reached Tenochtitlan, prompting the Noche Triste, the sad night, when Aztec warriors inflicted heavy losses on the Spaniards as they attempted to flee the city under cover of darkness. Cortés regrouped with Tlaxcalan forces, built a fleet of brigantines on Texcoco's shores, and laid siege to Tenochtitlan. After months of blockade, starvation, and relentless assault, the city fell on August 13, 1521. Cortés ordered the razing of Tenochtitlan and the construction of Mexico City in its place, establishing the viceroyalty of New Spain. Through military innovation, horse-mounted cavalry, steel swords, firearms, and the exploitation of internal divisions within the Aztec world, Cortés achieved one of the most spectacular conquests in history, securing unprecedented silver, textiles, and captivity tolls for Spain. A decade later, on the opposite flank of the Andes, Francisco Pizarro embarked on his own quest for empire. Inspired by Cortés's success and motivated by rumors of a vast empire of the sun, Pizarro led 3 expeditions along the Pacific coast of South America between 1524 and 1528, suffering shipwrecks, mutinies, and starvation. Undeterred, He returned in 1532 with a smaller force, usually estimated at around 180 Spaniards and 30 horses, accompanied by 600 native allies from the Andean foothills. Their target was the Inca Empire, then under the rule of Atahualpa, whose civil war against his half-brother Huáscar had weakened internal cohesion. In November 1532, Pizarro and his men met Atahualpa at Cajamarca during a feast arranged under a pretense of peace. Feigning submission, the Inca leader entered the plaza with thousands of unarmed attendants. Pizarro's cavalry charge and coordinated volley of arquebus fire and crossbow bolts left many Incas dead or fleeing. Atahualpa, taken prisoner, offered a room filled with gold and silver, an estimated ransom of 13,000 cubic feet of precious metal, for his release. The ransom was delivered in full, yet Pizarro executed Atahualpa in July 1533, citing charges of plotting rebellion. With the Inca leadership decapitated and the imperial center of Cusco vulnerable, Pizarro marched unopposed into the highland capital, capturing it by November 1533. Like Cortés, Pizarro relied on indigenous alliances, particularly dissident groups oppressed under Inca rule, and exploited technological advantages in weaponry, horses, and steel. The collapse of centralized authority, compounded by European diseases such as smallpox that had preceded the conquistadors, facilitated Spain's rapid consolidation of territory. Pizarro established the governorate of New Castile, laying the groundwork for the viceroyalty of Peru, and dispatched encomenderos to collect tribute and labor from the native population. The conquests of Cortés and Pizarro exemplify the dual pillars of early Spanish imperialism: military force buttressed by indigenous coalitions and religious mission, as friars and priests followed close behind to baptize and educate local peoples in Catholic doctrine. Their legacies were profound: the destruction of Mesoamerican and Andean political structures, the appropriation of immense wealth that fueled Spain's golden age, and the demographic and cultural transformations wrought by transplanted Eurasian crops, livestock, and diseases. Yet they also sparked resistance, marauding uprisings like that of Tupac Amaru in Peru decades later, and set in motion centuries-long dialogues on colonial governance, exploitation, and cultural fusion. From the ruins of Tenochtitlan and Cusco, Spain erected colonial cities: Mexico City, Lima, Cusco, each designed as a new seat of royal and religious authority, with grand cathedrals fronting central plazas. The blueprint for Spanish America was set: viceroys governing vast territories, audiencias dispensing justice, and encomienda, and later repartimiento systems extracting tribute. The conquistadors' daring feats thus inaugurated the transformation of the New World, forging a transoceanic empire whose riches and contradictions would reverberate across global history. After the swift military subjugation of the Aztec and Inca empires, Spain set about converting these vast territories into enduring colonial dominions. Spanish colonial rule rested on three intertwined pillars: administrative institutions that extended royal authority, economic structures that extracted wealth and labor from native populations, and the Catholic Church, which provided moral justification and social control. Together, these elements shaped a system in which exploitation and evangelization marched hand in hand. At the heart of colonial administration stood the viceroyalty. In 1535, Spain established the Viceroyalty of New Spain, centered in Mexico City, and in 1542, the Viceroyalty of Peru, governed from Lima. Each viceroy, appointed by the crown, oversaw civil and military affairs, judiciary functions, and fiscal policies. Beneath them, audiencias, high courts, and corregidors, local magistrates, exercised justice, collected taxes, and implemented royal edicts. While the system provided a semblance of legal order, it also enabled widespread corruption. Officials often demanded extractions beyond legal tribute, selling offices to the highest bidder and enriching themselves at native expense. Central to economic exploitation was the encomienda system. Crown law granted conquistadors and early settlers the right to collect tribute, gold, agricultural produce, textiles, and labor from designated groups of indigenous people. In return, encomenderos were supposed to provide protection and instruction. In Christianity, in practice, encomienda became a form of near-slave labor. In New Spain, communities of Tlaxcalans, Pipil, and other groups were compelled to work in mines, workshops, and haciendas under harsh conditions. In Peru, Andean Mitayos, peasants conscripted into labor drafts faced grueling service on silver estates at Potosí and Cerro Rico, where thousands died from exhaustion, malnutrition, and toxic mine fumes. The demographic impact was devastating. Scholars estimate that within the first century after conquest, native populations in central Mexico and the Andean highlands declined by as much as 80–90%, primarily due to epidemic disease, smallpox, measles, typhus, for which indigenous peoples had no immunity. Epidemics spread rapidly along colonial trade routes, reaching remote villages and undermining social structures. Survivors were often dispossessed of land and forced into labor systems, unable to sustain traditional practices of communal agriculture and craft production. To legitimize colonial rule and pacify restive populations, the Crown leveraged the Catholic missions. Orders such as the Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits arrived by the hundreds, building churches, schools, and hospitals. In Mexico, Franciscan friars established the 12 Apostles' missions around Mexico City in the 1520s, using Nahuatl language, sermons and visual catechisms, murals and wood carvings to teach doctrine. In the Andes, Jesuits founded reductions, urban settlements designed to congregate dispersed indigenous communities where they supervised labor, education, and religious instruction. The mission served dual purposes, converting souls while assimilating native labor into colonial economies, notably in cattle ranching and textile workshops. Yet missionary efforts often generated cultural syncretism as much as outright conversion. Indigenous peoples blended Catholic symbols with ancestral beliefs. Virgin of Guadalupe devotion absorbed pre-Hispanic notions of earth goddesses. Andean miners fashioned hand-blown glass beads at mountain altars, offering them to both Catholic saints and Apu, mountain spirits. Printers in Lima and Mexico City produced bilingual catechisms and grammars, Latin texts translated into Quechua, Nahuatl, and Maya, ensuring the Church's reach into native languages even as Spanish became lingua franca. Resistance to encomienda and mission control surfaced repeatedly. In New Spain, the Mixton Rebellion, 1540-42, in present-day Jalisco and Zacatecas, pitted Caxcan lords against Spanish and allied Tlaxcalan forces, resulting in a brutal suppression. In the Andes, Tupac Amaru's failed uprising in 1780-81 evinced deep resentment toward tribute burdens, forced labor, and cultural repression. Though crushed by colonial armies, such revolts signaled that exploitation under encomienda and mission discipline never secured genuine indigenous consent. Over time, the encomienda system declined under royal reforms. The new laws of 1542, advanced by reformers like Bartolomé de las Casas, sought to curb encomendero abuses, convert encomiendas into hereditary estates, and abolish indigenous slavery. Implementation was uneven, provoking encomendero rebellions in Peru and Mexico. By the late 16th century, encomienda gave way to the repartimiento system, in which labor drafts were administered by municipal authorities and theoretically more limited in duration. Meanwhile, African slavery increased, with enslaved Africans supplementing indigenous labor in sugar plantations in the Caribbean and coastal Mexico. By the 17th century, Spanish colonial society had stratified into peninsulares, Spain-born Spaniards, Criollos, American-born Spaniards, mestizos, indigenous peoples, and enslaved Africans, a complex hierarchy enforced through laws, customary practices, and economic barriers. Catholic missions continued to expand, laying the foundation for the deeply syncretic Catholicism that characterizes Latin America today. Native elites who converted and collaborated sometimes retained local authority, acting as intermediaries for colonial officials, while those who resisted faced punitive expeditions, forced relocations, or siege warfare. In sum, Spanish colonial rule in the Americas wove together administrative rigor, labor exploitation, and missionary zeal. The encomienda system channeled indigenous labor into mining and agriculture, enriching the crown and fueling Spain's European wars, while the Catholic missions sought to reshape native identities and secure spiritual allegiance. The result was an empire founded on both coercion and conversion, whose institutions and cultural legacies, legal frameworks, property patterns, religious practices would outlast colonial rule and continue to influence the social fabric of the Americas into the modern era. Treasure fleets and global trade. By the mid-16th century, Spain's imperial coffers overflowed with precious metals, drawn from the heart of the Americas. Silver from Potosí and gold from Mexico became the twin engines propelling Spain's economy, financing armies in Europe, underwriting royal patronage of the arts, and transforming global trade networks. In 1545, a vein of silver was discovered high in the rugged Andes of what is now Bolivia. Settlers quickly recognized the mountain's staggering potential and named it Cerro Rico, the Rich Mountain. Potosí sprouted almost overnight, swelling into one of the largest and most important cities in the Spanish Empire. At its peak, Potosí may have supported a population of up to 200,000, rivaling Paris or London in the 16th century. The city's silver mines produced an estimated 60,000 tons of silver over roughly 2.5 centuries, a fortune that transformed Spain into Europe's preeminent power. Mining at Potosi was brutal and dangerous. Enslaved indigenous workers and African slaves labored in narrow horizontal tunnels chiseled into the mountainside, extracting ore that contained as little as 5% silver. Harsh, cold, toxic mercury vapors from the patio process of refining and widespread malnutrition resulted in high mortality rates. Some historians estimate that hundreds of thousands perished in the pursuit of silver. Despite these human costs, the flow of silver reshaped European and Asian economies. Meanwhile, to the north, New Spain, centered on Mexico City, the successor to Tenochtitlan, yielded significant gold deposits and smaller quantities of silver. The legendary gold smelting works at Michoacán and the placer mines of Oaxaca produced ton after ton of bullion. By the 1540s, silver extracted in Mexico rivaled that of Peru. Gold, and to a lesser extent, copper and tin, further enriched Spain's New World Treasury, funding the expansion of churches, universities, and civic projects back in Castile. This torrent of precious metals necessitated new shipping systems. The Spanish crown organized an annual treasure fleet, the Flota de Indias, to transport bullion and colonial goods from the Americas to Seville, the empire's commercial capital. Each spring, squadrons of galleons assembled in Havana, Arizona, and Veracruz under the protection of armed escorts. Fully laden with silver bars, precious gemstones, cacao, cochineal dyes, and exotic woods, these vessels navigated the Gulf Stream and the Canary Current, converging at the Bahamas before charting a transatlantic course for Spain. Once ashore in Seville, the bullion was weighed and registered at the Casa de Contratación, then funneled into the royal treasury or circulated in Europe through banking houses in Antwerp, Genoa, and Amsterdam. Parallel to the Atlantic treasure, fleets, Spain pioneered a unique Pacific maritime link, the Manila galleons. Initiated in 1565 by Spanish navigator Miguel López de Legazpi, this annual voyage bridged Acapulco on Mexico's Pacific coast and Manila in the Philippine archipelago. On the outbound leg, galleons carried silver, often from Potosi, to Sao, purchased Chinese silks, porcelain, spices, and other luxury goods sought by European elites. These silk-laden ships then navigated the Pacific Gyre, delivering their cargo to Manila before turning eastward across the Pacific, arriving once again at Acapulco after a journey of nearly 4 months. The Manila galleon trade created the first sustained global maritime circuit. Silver from the Andes, minted and shipped from Acapulco, became the de facto currency of East Asia, fueling China's economy during the Ming dynasty. Chinese merchants, eager for silver due to imperial tax, reforms that mandated payment in that metal, supplied Manila with porcelain, lacquerware, silk, and lacquered objects. Japanese silver and Korean copper joined this trade, diversifying the galleon cargo. Meanwhile, Filipino boat builders and navigators provided essential maritime expertise, constructing sturdy hulls capable of enduring typhoons and equatorial doldrums. This trans-Pacific exchange rearranged global commercial patterns. European goods, woolens, metalwares, amber, trickled into Manila and were exchanged for Asian luxuries. Indian cotton and Middle Eastern indigo found their way to Mexico via Manila, enriching New Spain's textile industry. Spanish administrative officials in Manila collected taxes on trade, using revenues to fund fortifications and missionary activity in the Philippines. Over time, the galleons became floating microcosms of the empire, priests conducting mass at sea, soldiers guarding cargo holds, and merchants haggling over cargo manifests, all sailing under the cross and crown. Yet the treasure fleets and galleon routes also exposed the vulnerabilities of empire. Shipwrecks, hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean, typhoons in the Pacific, and attacks by English privateers, later pirates, threatened these lifelines. The loss of a single galleon could mean millions of maravedis in lost revenue and delay payments to Spanish creditors. To mitigate these risks, the Crown invested in naval convoys, coastal fortifications in Havana and Acapulco, and a network of lookouts along both coasts. Nevertheless, the silver and gold that flowed into Spain through this elaborate system fueled not only grand cathedrals and royal palaces, but also financed centuries of European warfare, from the Italian Wars to the 80 Years' War in the Low Countries. Inflation, known as the Price Revolution, spread across Europe, altering social structures as rising commodity prices eroded the purchasing power of fixed incomes. Meanwhile, Asia's appetite for silver tied Manila to Canton and the bustling Chinese ports, making the Spanish Empire a linchpin in global trade long before the term globalization existed. In this way, the treasure fleets and Manila galleons symbolized Spain's pioneering role in creating a truly interconnected world economy, one in which bullion, spices, silk, and human beings moved across oceans under imperial mandate. Yet behind the dazzling wealth lay tales of human cost: forced labor in mines, shipwrecked souls lost at sea, and the displacement of indigenous communities along colonial ports. As silver dust danced in Seville's coin workshops and galleons, docked under tropical suns, the empire's reach felt limitless, yet so too did its consequences reverberate among peoples both conquered and conquerors. The age of treasure, cross, and empire was in full swing, its currents carrying Spain's fortunes into every corner of the early modern world. By the mid-16th century, the wealth pouring into Spain from America transformed the modest Andalusian city of Seville into the beating heart of the Spanish Empire. Its golden age illustrates how one port could become the administrative, commercial, and cultural capital of a global realm, and how the constant flow of resources, people, and ideas across oceans reshaped both Europe and the wider world. Seville's ascendance began in 1503, when Queen Isabella granted the city a monopoly over trade with the New World. By royal decree, all ships bound for America had to depart and return to Seville's enclosed docks, known as the Casa de Contratación, or House of Trade. This institution oversaw navigation licenses, maintained the Padrón Real, the official map of the Indies, regulated commerce and collected duties, typically a quinto real or royal fifth of all precious metals and goods. The Casa de Contratación evolved into a bureaucratic behemoth. Surveyors compiled charts from returning pilots. Accountants tallied bullion inventories. Judges adjudicated disputes between merchants, and translators rendered indigenous vocabularies into Spanish. A consistent influx of treasure ships turned Seville's river, the Guadalquivir, into a flotilla of laden galleons, caravels, and patache vessels. Warehouse after warehouse lined the banks, stuffed with bullion, hides, sugar, cochineal dye, and timber. This wealth fueled Seville's urban expansion. Grand mansions, the casas señoriales, rose near the cathedral, their facades decorated with carved stone and ornamental tiles. Confraternities endowed chapels, funding altarpieces of gold leaf and imported oriental silks. The port's riches underwrote the careers of the Tavera and Medina families, who served as treasurers and judges in the casa. Meanwhile, the nearby Puerta de la Carne and Puerta del Arenal bustled with merchants, sailors, and financiers exchanging bills of exchange drawn on Genoese and Flemish banks. Seville's demographic swelled from some 25,000 inhabitants in 1500 to over 100,000 by mid-century, making it briefly one of Europe's largest cities. The demand for labor to load and unload ships, refine silver, weave cloth, and serve the burgeoning bureaucracy pulled migrants from the Castilian plateau, Andalusia's interior, and even from Italy and Flanders. Conversely, young Spaniards joined departing fleets, seeking fortune in the Americas. Some returned with fortunes, while others perished in shipwrecks or indigenous uprisings. Moreover, Seville became the empire's intellectual capital. Under royal patronage and the church's auspices, the University of Seville expanded its curricula to include courses on cosmography and law. The celebrated Portuguese cosmographer Pedro Nunes corresponded with Seville's navigation school, while Andrés de Urdaneta, who would later chart the westward return route from Manila, conducted experiments on currents and winds at the Casa. A cosmopolitan milieu of merchants, sailors, cartographers, and humanists enlivened the city's plazas and taverns with news and debate. Yet Seville's golden era had its pitfalls. The city's reliance on silver imports created a local economy out of balance, as artisans struggled when bullion arrived late or in reduced quantities. Inflation spiked, fueling social discontent among the poor. Periodic outbreaks of plague. In 1649, over half of Seville's residents perished, demonstrated that rapid urban growth and maritime traffic could carry more than goods. They imported disease and suffering as well. Flow of resources, people, and ideas. Across oceans, Seville's treasure fleets and Manila galleons stood at the center of a web of transoceanic flows that linked 4 continents. Beyond silver and gold, the constant exchange of commodities, people, and knowledge forged new social and economic connections. On the outbound leg from Seville, ships carried woolen cloth, olive oil, wine, steel armaments, and religious texts to the Americas. These goods supplied colonial elites and military garrisons, imprinting European material culture onto indigenous landscapes. In return, silver poured into European markets, spurring the price revolution, an inflationary surge that affected wages and peasant livelihoods across Spain and beyond. Fluctuating precious metal flows also impacted international finance. Antwerp and Genoa remained hubs for silver exchange, while Spanish coffers financed Habsburg armies in Italy and the Low Countries. Between Acapulco and Manila, silver funded the purchase of Chinese silks, porcelain, spices, and luxury woods, commodities that signaled prestige back in Europe. In Manila, a melting pot of Spanish, Chinese, Filipino, and Japanese merchants traded in the city's Parian, a designated quarter for Chinese resellers. Filipino porters and shipbuilders acquired European nautical techniques, while Jesuit missionaries introduced European astronomy and theology. Manila, as the nexus of Pacific commerce, epitomized the first truly global city where Mexican, Asian, and European worlds converged. Labor flows were equally significant. Indigenous guides and translators accompanied Spanish expeditions across Mesoamerica and the Andes, their linguistic skills crucial to diplomacy and conquest. African slaves, forcibly brought via the Atlantic, worked in coastal plantations in Cuba, Hispaniola, and later in Mexico's sugar mills. Conversely, a contingent of Sangli Chinese immigrants settled in Manila, establishing communities that influenced local cuisine, craft, and commerce. Intellectual exchanges crossed as well. Jesuit scholars in Lima and Mexico City compiled natural histories of New World flora and fauna, codices illustrating maize, potatoes, turkeys, and cacao. These manuscripts, copied and sent to Europe, enriched botanical gardens and inspired agricultural experiments with New World crops. Conversely, European livestock, horses, cattle, sheep, and fruit trees, figs, olives, transformed colonial ecosystems, enabling hacienda economies and altering indigenous subsistence patterns. Culturally, the Spanish Empire exported Baroque architecture, liturgical music, and religious festivals, which took root in St. Augustine, Florida, Cartagena, Colombia, and Cusco, Peru. These traditions melded with local forms. Andean syncretic fiestas honored Catholic saints alongside ancestral mountain spirits. Afro-Caribbean rhythms influenced religious processions in Havana. Spanish culinary techniques combined with native ingredients to spawn new cuisines in Puebla and Lima. In sum, the rise of Seville as the imperial capital and the flow of resources, people, and ideas across the Atlantic and Pacific defined Spain's global empire. Seville's docks were more than staging grounds for treasure fleets. They were crucibles where economic imperatives, bureaucratic innovation, cultural syncretism, and human ambition intersected. The currents that carried silver from Potosi, silk from Canton, and settlers from Andalusia forged an early modern world that was interconnected, dynamic, and often unequal, yet foundational to the globalization that would follow. As we continue our journey, these patterns of empire building will echo in later chapters, reminding us that even distant continents were woven into Spain's imperial tapestry by the movement of ships and the voices of countless travelers. Spain, in Europe, Habsburg power and imperial wars. By the early 16th century, Spain had become more than a unified kingdom. It was the linchpin of an empire that spanned from the Atlantic archipelagos to the Americas. At the center of this vast realm stood Charles V, born in 1500 in Ghent, the scion of the powerful Habsburg dynasty. Through a series of dynastic inheritances and strategic marriages, Charles inherited a constellation of territories that made him uniquely ruler of an empire on which the sun never set. When his grandfather, Maximilian I of Habsburg, died in 1519, Charles became heir to the prestigious Habsburg patrimony in Austria, the Burgundian lands in the Low Countries, and through his mother, Joanna of Castile, Joanna the Mad, all Spanish kingdoms, Castile, Aragon, Navarre, Sicily, Naples, and the recently conquered American territories. Elected Holy Roman Emperor in 1519, Charles thus held the crowns of Spain and Germany simultaneously, overseeing a polyglot empire ruled from multiple capitals, Toledo, Seville, Brussels, and Vienna. From the outset, Charles faced the challenge of defending and consolidating his inherited domains. His reign was defined by near-constant wars against France, the Ottoman Empire, and the burgeoning Protestant movement within his Germanic realms, all while administering the treasures arriving from the New World. France, under Francis I, contested Habsburg encirclement on two fronts, in northern Italy and along the Pyrenean border. The Italian Wars, 1494–1559, provided the primary theatre. In 1521, Charles, then King of Spain and Duke of Burgundy, joined Pope Leo X and Venice against Francis I, capturing Milan and humiliating the French at Brescia. The following year, the fluid fortunes of war reversed. Francis captured Pavia, after defeating an imperial army, taking the French king prisoner and negotiating the Treaty of Madrid, 1526. Yet neither side honored this treaty's terms. Hostilities resumed, culminating in Francis's entry into the League of Cognac, 1526, against Charles, which led to the emperor's troops sacking Rome in 1527. Meanwhile, on the Iberian southwest, Spanish border fortresses were strengthened as Francis supported local rebellions in Navarre. Charles's generals conducted raids into southern France, openly demonstrating that the peninsular frontier was as contested as the Italian plains. These wars drained the royal treasury, requiring heavy taxation and loans secured against new world revenue, yet they also reinforced Spain's reputation for military prowess. Eastward, Charles confronted another existential threat, the expansion of the Ottoman Turks. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent pressed into the Balkans, threatening Vienna and Mediterranean shipping. Charles's response was to forge alliances with the papacy and Italian states, financing an imperial navy under Andrea Doria, which won a decisive victory over Ottoman corsairs at Preveza in 1538. On land, Charles supported Austrian archdukes and local princes resisting Ottoman incursions, though his commitments were often limited by the far greater demands of his Western wars. Nonetheless, the Habsburg-Ottoman front remained a crucial dimension of Charles's imperial defense, illustrating how his realms stretched from Cadiz to Constantinople's gates. Within the Holy Roman Empire, Charles faced a religious as well as political challenge. The rise of Lutheranism, following Martin Luther's 1517 Theses. As emperor, Charles presided over the Diet of Worms, 1521, where Luther was declared an outlaw. Yet enforcing imperial edicts against heresy proved difficult. German princes shielded reformers, and protest and petition led to the Schmalkaldic League, 1531, a defensive alliance of Lutheran territories. Charles launched a military campaign in 1546 to subdue the League, capturing key cities and defeating the League's forces at Mühlberg in 1547. However, political complexities and lack of funds, partly drained by his Mediterranean commitments, forced him to negotiate rather than impose religious uniformity. The resulting Augsburg Interim, 1548, attempted a religious compromise but satisfied neither Catholics nor Protestants. Eventually, religious pluralism was enshrined in the Peace of Augsburg, 1555, granting each prince the right to determine his territory's confession, cuius regio, eius religio. Despite these manifold conflicts, Charles maintained the loyalty of his diverse subjects through a combination of dynastic legitimacy, legal institutions like the Council of State in Spain, and the wealth flowing from the Americas. His reign thus illustrates how 16th-century sovereignty depended not only on military might, but on the intricate management of resources, silver to finance armies, and strategic marriages, such as his divorce of his sister Mary's daughter to Philip II, who would inherit the Spanish crown. By 1556, worn by decades of campaigning and plagued by ill health, especially chronic gout, Charles abdicated his vast domains, transferring Spain, the Netherlands, and the overseas empire to his son Philip II, while granting the imperial crown and Austrian lands to his brother Ferdinand I. This partition preserved Habsburg dominance in Europe and marked the end of an era. Charles retired to the monastery of Yuste in Extremadura, where he spent his final years in contemplative solitude, dying in 1558. His abdication passed the torch to a new generation, one that would continue to wage Europe's great conflicts, yet inherited an empire whose foundations were laid in the Reconquista and global voyages of discovery. Charles V's reign, defined by wars against France, the Ottoman Turks, and Protestant princes, demonstrates the burdens of ruling a truly global empire. His struggles to secure dynastic territories, defend Christendom, and manage transatlantic wealth reveal the intricate interplay of politics, religion, and economics in early modern monarchy. As Spain's European wars raged on, the empire's heartland in the Americas continued to supply the silver and manpower that underpinned Habsburg aspirations, affirming that Spain's global strength rested as much on the New World's riches as on European battlefields. When Philip II ascended the Spanish throne in 1556, he inherited an empire whose grandeur was matched only by its burdens. As the son of Charles V and Isabella of Valois, Philip was steeped in the traditions of Habsburg rule, unwavering devotion to Catholic orthodoxy, personal piety, and administrative rigor. His reign, which lasted until 1598, marked the zenith and beginning of the turn of Spain's European power. Two defining features stand out: the rise and dispatch of the Spanish Armada against England in 1588, and a relentless religious zeal that pushed the empire toward overextension. Philip II moved his court from Valladolid to the newly completed Escorial, a palatial monastery complex northwest of Madrid, symbolizing both imperial authority and spiritual devotion. From this base, he directed Spain's vast resources. Concerned by England's support for Dutch rebels and the privateering of English sea captains, most notably Sir Francis Drake, who had sacked Spanish ports and captured treasure ships, Philip resolved to restore Catholic dominance and curb English interference. The centerpiece of Philip's plan was the Invincible Armada, a fleet of some 130 ships, including galleons, supply vessels, and troop transports, designed to escort an army from the Spanish Netherlands to invade England. Planning began in the 1570s under the Duke of Medina Sidonia's command. The Armada carried over 8,000 soldiers and 2,000 sailors, along with provisions for months at sea. Spain's arsenals in the Basque Country and Galicia buzzed with shipbuilding, while Castilian silver financed the enterprise, one of the largest military undertakings of the 16th century. Launched in May 1588, the fleet entered the English Channel in late July. Yet the Armada's meticulous timetable unravelled quickly. English ships, lighter and more manoeuvrable, employed long-range cannon fire to harry the cumbersome galleons. At Calais, the English set burning ships adrift, forcing the Armada to cut anchor and scatter. With adverse winds preventing the planned rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's army in the Low Countries, Medina Sidonia ordered a retreat around Scotland and Ireland, waters notorious for storms and shoals. Over the next month, shipwrecks, disease, and supply shortages decimated the fleet. Fewer than half of the Armada's vessels limped back to Spain. Though Philip's ambitions were thwarted, the psychological impact was profound. England's naval victories bolstered Protestant confidence across Europe. Spain, meanwhile, faced the staggering financial cost of refitting broken ships and replenishing lost men and materiel. The Armada's failure marked a turning point. While Spain remained formidable, its aura of invincibility had shattered. Philip II's era was characterized by an obsessive religious zeal shaped by the Counter-Reformation. He enforced the decrees of the Council of Trent, 1545-1563, with severity, strengthening the Spanish Inquisition to root out heresy and moral laxity. Clerical reform, the foundation of seminaries, and the patronage of new religious orders, the Discalced Carmelites and Society of Jesus, underscored Philip's conviction that Catholicism formed the empire's spiritual core. This zeal extended beyond Spain's borders. In the Netherlands, Philip's ban on Protestant worship sparked the Dutch Revolt, 1568-1648, a protracted conflict that drained imperial resources for decades. His policies, heavy taxation to fund wars, imposition of burghers of loyal officials, and harsh repression by the Duke of Alva's Council of Troubles, turned moderate Protestants toward resistance. When the northern provinces declared independence as the Dutch Republic, Spain lost one of its wealthiest territories and key trading centers in Antwerp and Amsterdam. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean, Philip waged a long struggle against the Ottoman Empire, supporting the Holy League at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. That spectacular naval victory, in which a coalition of Spanish, Venetian, Papal, and Genoese ships defeated the Ottoman fleet, halted Ottoman expansion in the western Mediterranean. Yet victory came at a cost. Fleets required constant maintenance, and garrisons in Sicily, Naples, and Malta demanded funding. Philip's religious imperative also extended to the Americas and Asia. He reinforced the mission system in the Philippines, building Manila into a fortified city and sending Jesuits and Augustinians to convert thousands. In Mexico and Peru, royal decrees mandated annual tithes to build cathedrals, monasteries, and universities, Rome's architectural footprint in the New World. While devout, These expenditures further strained royal coffers already depleted by European conflicts. By the late 16th century, Spain's imperial commitments had spiraled into overextension. Annual revenues, dominated by silver from Potosi, funded armies in the Netherlands, fleets in the North Sea and Mediterranean, missionary enterprises in the Pacific, and an enormous court at the Escorial. Economic distortions from precious metal, inflow triggered inflation, undermined manufacturing, and discouraged domestic agriculture. Spanish guilds faltered, while reliance on foreign bankers and mercenary armies increased debt and dependence on external resources. Moreover, the empire's sheer-scale complicated governance, communications between Madrid, Brussels, Lisbon and Manila took months. Viceroys and governors often acted autonomously, pursuing local interests that conflicted with royal directives. Corruption, favoritism, and black market practices swelled as colonial officials exploited lax oversight. In the Spanish Netherlands, the revolt evolved into a protracted guerrilla war. In the Atlantic, English, French, and Dutch privateers increasingly challenged Spain's treasure fleets, while in Asia, Portuguese rivals and native sultanates contested Manila's claims. Philip died in 1598, leaving his son Philip III a sprawling empire at the precipice of decline. The successes of Lepanto and earlier Reconquista victories were overshadowed by the failures of the Armada and the costly Dutch War. Nevertheless, Spain's 16th century high tide, shaped by the rise of Philip II, religious fervor, and expansive military campaigns, etched an imperial culture of devout monarchs, global warfare, and an unshakable belief in Spain's divine mission. Yet that very devotion and ambition would, over time, become the forces that stretched Spain's resources too thin, signaling the slow ebb of Habsburg preeminence and foreshadowing an empire in retreat. The Spanish Golden Age, art, science, and culture. By the late 16th and early 17th centuries, Spain's military and political fortunes had begun to wane, yet an unparalleled efflorescence of creativity and learning, often termed the Spanish Golden Age, reached its height. While silver from the Americas continued to flow into the royal treasury, Spain's greatest treasures were its artists and writers, whose works would shape Western literature, painting, and intellectual life for centuries to come. At the forefront of Spain's literary renaissance stood Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra, born in Alcalá de Henares in 1547. Cervantes's early life mirrored the tumult of his times. He fought at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, was wounded in the left hand, and endured 5 years of captivity in Algiers. These experiences infused his later writing with depth, nuance, and a wry understanding of human folly. In 1605, at the age of 57, Cervantes published Don Quixote de la Mancha, a novel so revolutionary that it is often cited as the first modern novel. Its hero, Alonso Quijano, an aging hidalgo obsessed with chivalric romances, sets out as Don Quixote accompanied by his pragmatic squire, Sancho Panza, to revive knightly virtues in a world that has long abandoned them. Their adventures, tilting at windmills he believes to be giants, liberating imaginary damsels and mistaking inns for enchanted castles, blend irony with pathos, fantasy with stark realism. Cervantes's prose captured the zeitgeist of an empire in flux. The tension between idealism and disillusionment, the collision of old feudal ideals with emerging modern sensibilities, and the shifting boundaries between sanity and madness. More than mere parody, Don Quixote explores themes of friendship, identity, and the power of storytelling itself. Its immediate success spawned Part 2 in 1615, completing a work that would be translated into countless languages and influence authors from Dickens to Borges. Alongside Cervantes, Spain produced distinguished poets and playwrights. Lope de Vega, sometimes called the Phoenix of Wits, penned over 1,500 plays, redefining Spanish drama with his blend of commedia humanism, interweaving comedy, tragedy, and historical themes. His contemporary Calderón de la Barca explored metaphysical questions in plays like Life is a Dream, meditating on fate, free will, and the nature of reality. Their works dominated Spain's corrals, open-air theatres, appealing to nobles and commoners alike. Spain's Golden Age painting likewise produced masters whose brushstrokes transcended their era. El Greco, Domenicos Theotokopoulos, arrived in Toledo in 1577, bringing with him the dramatic flair of Venetian colorism and Byzantine iconography. His elongated figures, saints, martyrs, and biblical scenes radiated intense spirituality. In works such as The Burial of the Count of Orgaz, El Greco captured the miraculous descent of Christ and saints above a meticulously rendered Spanish funeral, fusing celestial mysticism with earthy precision. His expressive use of light and color would influence Baroque and Expressionist artists centuries later. In Seville, Diego Velázquez emerged as the preeminent court painter of Philip IV. Appointed Pintor del Rey in 1623, Velázquez mastered the art of conveying intimacy and realism in portraiture. In Las Meninas, 1656, Velázquez presented a complex, layered scene. The Infanta Margarita Teresa, surrounded by her attendants, with the king and queen's reflection visible in a mirror. This ingenious composition, playing with perspective, the act of painting itself, and the gaze between viewer and subject, signaled a breakthrough in Western art. Velázquez's technique, loose brushwork, that at close view appears abstract, but coalesces into crystalline detail from a distance, redefined the possibilities of oil painting. His portraits of courtiers, dwarfs, and servants convey empathy and psychological depth, while his bodegones, kitchen scenes, capture quotidian life with dignity. Works such as Old Woman Frying Eggs demonstrate his ability to transform humble subjects into profound studies of light, texture, and stillness. Velázquez and El Greco embodied Spain's dual artistic legacies, the ornate spirituality of the Renaissance South and the sober realism of the Baroque North. They drew upon Italy's innovations while forging a distinctive Spanish vocabulary, one that echoed the empire's grandeur and the complex cross-currents of religion, politics, and cultural encounter. Beyond literature and painting, Spain's Golden Age witnessed advances in science and scholarship. The Toledo School of Translators had long acted as a conduit for Arabic and Greek knowledge, and in the 16th century, figures like Juan de la Cosa and Andrés de Urdaneta applied navigational astronomy to chart transoceanic routes. Universities such as Salamanca and Alcalá trained jurists, theologians and cosmographers who debated the ethics of conquest, the rights of indigenous peoples, and the nature of the cosmos. Yet this cultural flourishing existed alongside the realities of imperial power, the wealth of New World silver, the clergy's authority secured by political alliances, and an increasingly rigid social hierarchy. While courtly audiences revelled in Cervantes' satire and Velázquez's virtuosity, peasants and urban poor felt the strains of inflation and taxation. The coexistence of these divergent experiences, brilliant artistic achievement and socio-economic hardship, characterizes the complexity of Spain's golden age. In the chapters ahead, we will explore how these cultural triumphs interacted with Spain's political and economic challenges, how art and literature both celebrated and critiqued imperial power, and how the legacies of Cervantes, Lope, Velázquez, and their contemporaries continued to shape the Spanish-speaking world long after the glitter of Potosí's silver had waned. For now, we savor the splendor of the Spanish Golden Age, a moment when creativity and devotion intertwined, offering humanity enduring works of genius amid an empire's rising and falling tides. Under the Habsburgs, Spain's intellectual life flourished alongside its arts. Recognizing the importance of learning to administer a vast empire and legitimize divine monarchy, Philip II and his successors endowed universities and scientific enterprises across the kingdom. In Salamanca, one of Europe's oldest universities, chairs in canon law, theology and astronomy attracted scholars from Portugal, Italy and beyond. Professors like Francisco de Vitoria pioneered theories of international law and natural rights, arguing for indigenous peoples' humanity and the limits of conquest, ideas that anticipated modern human rights discourse. Meanwhile, in Madrid, the newly founded Colegio Imperial sponsored studies in mechanics, navigation, and cartography. Navigators who had sailed the Pacific, such as Andrés de Urdaneta, lectured on currents and winds, training new pilots for the Manila galleon trade. At the Escorial, Philip II's majestic palace monastery, laboratories and workshops tested firearms and refining processes for silver, while its famed library amassed manuscripts in Greek, Arabic and Hebrew, continuing Spain's medieval tradition of translation and scholarship. The Crown also backed expeditions like those of José de Acosta, whose observations of the Andes flora and fauna in the 1580s constituted early natural history. Acosta's Natural and Moral History of the Indies offered Europeans detailed accounts of New World ecosystems, bridging scientific curiosity with missionary zeal. Yet Spain's Golden Age bore a stark contradiction. The same empire that produced Cervantes and Velázquez relied on systems of colonial exploitation and religious repression abroad. While university chairs debated the rights of indigenous peoples, encomenderos in Mexico and Peru forced native communities into back-breaking labor under the guise of Christian instruction. The Jesuits' reductions in Paraguay protected some Guarani from enslavement, but in other territories, missionaries facilitated the crown's control by teaching obedience alongside salvation. The wealth that endowed libraries and academies in Salamanca derived in large part from Potosi's mines, where human lives were expendable and mercury's fumes lethal. This paradox extended to domestic life. In Seville and Madrid, nobles and intellectuals gathered in tertulias, salons where poetry was recited and philosophical debates ignited. Theatrical companies performed Lope de Vega's plays before enthralled audiences. Royal patronage funded scientific societies that corresponded with Italy's Accademia dei Lincei. Yet, at the same moment, Spain's treasury underwrote the Inquisition's harsh scrutiny of heresy and moral offences. Free thinkers risked confiscation of property, torture, and even execution for contradicting orthodox doctrine. The brilliant architecture of the Escorial masked corridors, where suspected heterodox texts were seized and burned. Moreover, Spain's military endeavours against France, Protestant princes, and Ottoman fleets drained resources that might have further advanced domestic welfare and learning. By the end of the 17th century, the empire's overreach had weakened its economy. Universities that once thrived became hotbeds of scholastic conservatism, resistant to newer scientific methods emerging in England, France, and Holland. The very riches that built splendid cathedrals and paid for art commissions also fueled inflation, burdened peasants with high taxes, and stoked resentment toward the nobility and clergy. Thus, the Spanish Golden Age stands as a study in contrasts, a time when Spain was Europe's cultural and intellectual beacon, yet also a period marked by colonial cruelty and domestic repression. The same crown that sponsored voyages of discovery and funded universities also enforced religious uniformity and extracted wealth through exploitative systems. This interplay of creation and destruction shaped Spain's legacy, producing masterpieces of art, literature, and thought even as the empire's foundations were eroded by contradictions between its loftiest ideals and brutal realities. As we move into the empire's decline, these tensions will intensify, testing the resilience of Spanish culture and statecraft in an increasingly competitive and pluralistic Europe. Decline and crisis, 17th century struggles. By the early 17th century, the Spanish Empire, once the unrivaled colossus of Europe, began to buckle under the weight of its own grandeur. What had seemed an inexhaustible tide of American silver was ebbing. Silver ores grew harder to extract, and royal coffers ran dangerously low. This economic contraction coincided with successive waves of plague that decimated cities and undermined productivity, while far-flung military commitments sapped resources. Simultaneously, internal dissent erupted into open revolts in Catalonia and Portugal, fracturing the unity of the Iberian realms and exposing the empire's fragility. Economic troubles and plagued Spain's prosperity had long hinged on the inflow of New World silver. Yet by the 1620s, the easily accessible veins of Potosi and Zacatecas were depleted, and refractory ores demanded more labor and mercury to refine. Shipments of bullion became erratic. The annual treasure fleets suffered storms, piracy, and mismanagement. Consequently, the price revolution that had once enriched Spain turned malignant, fueling runaway inflation that eroded real wages. Grain, olive oil, and wine grew more expensive, provoking hardship for urban artisans and rural laborers alike. To finance ongoing wars, most notably the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, on behalf of Habsburg interests, Philip III and Philip IV resorted to repeated sales of juros, state-backed annuities, and large-scale borrowing from Genoese bankers. By mid-century, the Crown spent more on debt service than on governance or military pay. Royal bankruptcy declarations in 1607, 1627, and 1647 punctuated this financial retrenchment, undermining confidence in Spain's credit and contributing to a stagnating economy. As economic woes mounted, the plague struck Spain with devastating regularity. Cities such as Seville, Valencia, and Barcelona endured outbreaks in 1609-10, 1647-49, and again in 1659-61. Contemporary accounts describe entire neighborhoods emptied of life, markets abandoned, churches shuttered, and mass graves dug within hours. Mortality rates approached 30–40% in hard-hit areas, amplifying labor shortages and crippling agricultural cycles. Rural villages, already stressed by high taxation, saw survivors abandon fields, leading to decreased yields and periodic famines. The plague's spectre lent a grim backdrop to Spain's economic decline, as public health infrastructure, little more than rudimentary quarantines and lazarettos, proved inadequate against successive scourges. Against this backdrop of fiscal crisis and demographic collapse, regional resentments exploded into rebellion. In Catalonia, tension had simmered for decades over the union of arms proposed by Count Duke Olivares, chief minister to Philip IV. Conceived in 1626, the plan aimed to distribute the burdens of imperial defense, troop levies and taxation more equitably across Spain's constituent realms. Catalans, fiercely protective of their fueros, regional privileges, and autonomy, regarded Olivares's initiative as an assault on their ancient rights. As Castilian troops billeted in Barcelona and Catalan castles were garrisoned for overseas campaigns, local elites and rural peasants united in opposition. In September 1640, a riot in Barcelona known as the Corpus de Sang, blood corpus, spiraled into full-scale rebellion. Catalan leaders declared a Catalan republic under French protection, aligning with France, Spain's principal wartime foe, to safeguard their liberties. Over the next years, French troops occupied parts of Catalonia, and the region became a battleground of the Franco-Spanish War, 1635–1659, diverting Spanish resources and attention from Northern Europe and the Americas. Even more startling was Portugal's revolt in December 1640. Discontent in Portugal had also grown under the centralizing policies of the Habsburgs, who since 1580 had ruled the Portuguese crown following the Iberian Union. Portuguese nobles resented Castilian dominance in royal offices and the new taxes imposed to fund Spanish wars. A conspiratorial movement culminated in a coup on December 1, 1640, when conspirators assassinated the Portuguese Secretary of State and acclaimed John IV of the House of Braganza as king. Philip IV found himself unable to muster sufficient forces to suppress the uprising. Spain was overextended, its war chest drained, and its armies tied up in multiple theatres. Portugal's secession sparked 8 years of war known as the Portuguese Restoration War, 1640–1668. Though Spain initially deployed veteran tercios, Portuguese terrain and guerrilla tactics prevented easy victory. By the 1668 Treaty of Lisbon, Spain formally recognized Portugal's independence, marking the failure of the Union of Arms and the definitive fracture of the Iberian monarchy. The dual revolts in Catalonia and Portugal revealed the limits of absolutist governance when economic underpinnings collapse and regional identities assert themselves. Spain's imperial overreach, fighting wars from Flanders to Catalonia, from Vienna's defences to Lisbon's reconquest, had eroded popular support. Each uprising further depleted scarce resources and accelerated the empire's decline in the latter half of the 17th century. As 17th century struggles unfolded, economic contraction, recurrent plagues and regional revolts, Spain's imperial sheen faded. Yet these crises also prompted administrative reforms under ministers like Luis de Haro, who streamlined tax collection and negotiated peace treaties. In the chapters ahead, we will explore how the Bourbon dynasty, installed after the War of Spanish Succession, sought to revive Spain's fortunes through enlightened reforms and centralized governance, while confronting the legacy of Habsburg decline. For now, the 17th century stands as a testament to how even the mightiest empire can succumb to the combined pressures of finance, disease, and internal dissent. As Spain grappled with economic collapse, plague, and internal revolts in Catalonia, and Portugal, its grip on European territories beyond the peninsula also loosened. Once dominant in Italy, the Low Countries, and the Mediterranean, the Habsburg monarchy faced challenges that eroded its continental hegemony. This period witnessed declining control over European territories and Spain's loss of the Dutch provinces, paving the way for the ascendancy of new rival powers. At the dawn of the 17th century, Spanish forces held sway in northern Italy, in Lombardy and the Kingdom of Naples, protecting these territories through garrisons and Spanish viceroys. Yet with dwindling revenues, Madrid struggled to pay and supply its armies. Fortress walls crumbled for lack of maintenance, and mercenary troops, unpaid for months, deserted or mutinied. In 1647, the Neapolitan populace, burdened by famine and heavy taxation, rose in the revolt of Masaniello, challenging Spanish rule until the viceroy's harsh reprisals reasserted control, but at immense cost to loyalty and local goodwill. In the eastern Mediterranean, Spain's role in the Holy League against the Ottomans had once bolstered its naval prestige. However, with Dutch and Venetian navies emerging as formidable competitors, the Spanish Armada's successors lost sea battles and trade routes. Spanish galleys withdrew from major Adriatic ports, and in North Africa, formerly loyal pirate repellent, presidios like Oran and Algiers faced repeated raids. The Venetian-Ottoman rivalry supplanted Spanish primacy, and by mid-century, Santiago de la Ribera's Mediterranean prowess had waned. Similarly, in Germany, the 30 Years' War, fought from 1618 to 1648, drained Spanish resources. Spain sought to protect its Habsburg relatives' interests in southern Germany, sending troops to support imperial forces. But defeats at Nordlingen, 1634, and Breitenfeld, in 1642, weakened Spain's position. The Peace of Westphalia, 1648, confirmed the sovereignty of German princes and recognized the independence of the Dutch Republic, effectively ending any Spanish hopes of centralized control over the Holy Roman Empire. Spain's raison d'être, defending Catholicism and dynastic unity, thus suffered a crippling blow. The most consequential blow to Spain's European dominion was the independence of the Dutch provinces. Beginning in 1568, the 80 Years' War pitted Spain against the 17 provinces of the Low Countries, where Protestant sentiments and urban mercantile interests clashed with Habsburg authoritarianism and heavy taxation. Despite brutal campaigns by the Duke of Alva and his successors, the rebellious provinces held fast, buoyed by Dutch naval strength and financing from English and French subsidies. In 1581, the northern provinces formally declared independence in the Act of Abjuration, crowning William of Orange as their leader. Over the ensuing decades, Spain's attempts to reconquer the region faltered, culminating in the 12 Years' Truce, 1609-1621. During this lull, the Dutch Republic consolidated its institutions, developed its Republic of Letters, and expanded its East India Company, VOC, outpacing Spanish trade in Asia. Renewed hostilities after 1621 saw initial Spanish successes under the Cardinal Infante Ferdinand, but by mid-century, the Dutch had perfected maritime commerce and colonial administration. They captured key Portuguese and Spanish outposts in Asia, Malacca, Ceylon, and parts of Brazil, eroding Iberian monopolies. Meanwhile, the Battle of the Downs, 1639, saw the Dutch navy decisively defeat a Spanish fleet off England's coast, confirming Dutch naval supremacy. The Dutch victory had broader repercussions. The burgeoning Dutch Golden Age, 17th century, saw Amsterdam emerge as Europe's financial capital, rivaling Antwerp and Genoa. Dutch banks issued loans to European monarchs, including Spain itself, and Dutch merchants underwrote trade with the Baltic, Africa, and the East Indies. Spain's own silver, once the pivot of global finance, circulated in Dutch hands, enabling Amsterdam to reinvest in shipbuilding, arts, and intellectual life. Concurrently, France under Louis XIII and his minister Cardinal Richelieu, and later, under Louis XIV, capitalized on Spanish weakness. Richelieu's policy of raison d'etat led France into the 30 Years' War on the Protestant side, despite being Catholic, solely to weaken the Habsburgs. French armies invaded Lorraine, Alsace, and Catalonia, 1640-1652, even temporarily occupying Barcelona when Catalan rebels allied with France. The Treaty of the Pyrenees, 1659, formalized French gains. Roussillon, parts of Cerdagne, and the Artois region passed to France. Spain's northern border contracted significantly, marking France's ascendancy as Europe's preeminent land power. In Britain, Elizabethan sea dogs had challenged Spain in the late 16th century, but by the mid-17th century, English and Scottish navies, unified under Cromwell's Commonwealth, contested Spain's overseas trade. English pirates attacked silver fleets, and colonization efforts in North America, Virginia, Barbados, undercut Spanish claims. The 1654–60 Anglo-Spanish War, though limited, signaled the end of Spanish naval monopoly in the Caribbean and Atlantic. By the close of the 17th century, Spain's European hegemony lay in tatters. The empire that once spanned Flanders, Milan, the Rhineland, Naples, Sicily, and beyond had contracted. The Dutch Republic had risen, France had annexed border provinces, Britain had established colonial footholds, and the Holy Roman Empire had fragmented into sovereign states. Spain remained a major Catholic power, but no longer the uncontested leader of continental Christendom. These reversals, loss of the Dutch provinces and the rise of rival European powers, stemmed from the combined strains of overextended military commitments, fiscal insolvency, and rigid governance. The Habsburg monarchy's inability to adapt to shifting economic and political realities contrasted sharply with the agility of the Dutch mercantile republic and the centralized reforms of Bourbon France. As we move into the next chapters, we will see how the Bourbon dynasty attempted to revitalize Spain through new administrative and fiscal reforms, hoping to reclaim lost glory even as the balance of power in Europe had irrevocably shifted. The Shui, Bourbon reforms and new imperial order. When Charles II died in 1700 without an heir, Europe held its breath as rival dynasties poised to claim Spain's vast domains. The resulting War of the Spanish Succession raged for over a decade across battlefields from the Low Countries to the hills of Catalonia. Ultimately, in the treaties of Utrecht and Rastatt, 1713–1714, Philip of Anjou, a grandson of France's Louis XIV, was confirmed as Philip V of Spain, but only upon the solemn promise that Spain and France would remain separate kingdoms. Thus, the mighty Habsburg inheritance passed into Bourbon hands. Philip V arrived in Madrid, determined to undo the administrative chaos and fiscal collapse that had festered under the late Habsburgs. He found royal finances shattered by decades of war, silver fleets plundered by pirates, and colonial revenues diluted by smuggling and corruption. To revive imperial authority, he called upon reform-minded ministers, most notably José de Galvez and the Count of Aranda, to reconfigure both the metropole and its overseas possessions. Thus began the era of the Bourbon reforms, an ambitious program that would redraw maps, reorganize government, and tighten the crown's grip on New World treasure. In the colonies, the first act was to dismantle the unwieldy viceroyalties that had become too vast to govern effectively. In 1717, the viceroyalty of New Granada was carved out of Peru, acknowledging that Bogotá needed its own seat of power to manage the Caribbean littoral and the Andean highlands. Later, in 1776, the viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata emerged around Buenos Aires, relieving Lima of its sprawling southern responsibilities. New audiencias, or high courts, were established in Bogotá, Caracas, and Buenos Aires, ensuring that justice and royal decrees traveled swiftly from Madrid to the Americas. Yet administrative redrawing was only half the task. Spain's coffers had run dry under the Habsburgs, and colonial taxes teetered on collapse. The Bourbon ministers introduced the intendanta system, appointing officials answerable directly to Madrid to oversee finance, policing, and infrastructure in each province. Gone were the local cabildos with their entrenched Creole elites. In their place stood crown-appointed magistrates charged with conducting land surveys, standardizing tribute collection, and rooting out smuggling networks. These intendentes wielded sweeping powers, reporting yearly harvests, tax yields, and public works progress back to the Council of the Indies. Trade policies, too, underwent a dramatic overhaul. Under the flawed Habsburg monopoly, silver and goods were funneled only through Seville, then Cadiz, creating bottlenecks and encouraging illicit exchange. The Bourbons cracked open colonial commerce, granting legal trading rights to Cartagena, Veracruz, Buenos Aires, and even Manila. Convoy schedules were formalized, with merchant ships sailing on fixed calendars. Galleons no longer drifted with the winds, but followed strategic lines dictated by the crown, reducing losses to pirates and storms. Consequently, colonial ports thrived anew, and Madrid's customs revenues swelled, repaying loans to Genoese bankers who had once financed Spanish bankruptcy. To safeguard these reforms, Spain's military presence in the Americas and the Philippines was strengthened. Castles were rebuilt along Veracruz's coast. Havana's harbor bristled with new fortifications, and Manila's walls echoed with drills of the provincial militias, Creole officers working alongside Spanish regulars. These forces deterred British and Dutch privateers, whose leather-booted crews had once stalked Spanish treasure fleets with impunity. Perhaps the most radical Bourbon measure was the expulsion of the Society of Jesus in 1767. Charles III, Philip Faye's grandson, suspected Jesuits of fomenting Creole dissent and controlling too many educational institutions. Overnight, Jesuit schools and missions were seized, their vast estates absorbed into the royal domain. In their place, secular ministries took charge of schools and universities. San Marcos in Lima, the Royal and Pontifical University of Mexico, and new colleges in Guadalajara and Santo Domingo, instilling Enlightenment curricula in astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy. Through these sweeping changes, new viceroyalties, intendantes, open trade, fortified defences, and secular education, the Bourbon kings forged a more centralised and resilient imperial order. They revived the flagging fortunes of Spain's overseas dominions, tapped fresh sources of revenue, and built a bureaucracy capable of enforcing royal will from Madrid to Manila. Yet these very reforms sowed seeds of discontent among Creole elites who chafed under peninsular appointees and resented their own loss of autonomy. As the 18th century progressed, the Bourbon reforms would prove a double-edged sword, revitalizing the empire even as they set in motion the forces that would, decades later, sever Spain's American holdings. In the next chapter, we will explore how Enlightenment ideas and Creole unrest converged to challenge Bourbon authority, lighting the fuse of independence across the Spanish world. Across the vast expanse of Spain's American dominions, the Bourbon monarchs implemented a bold reconfiguration of imperial governance. Central to this effort was the creation of new viceroyalties, which redrew colonial boundaries in ways that both improved administration and unintentionally sowed the seeds of dissent. In 1717, the sprawling viceroyalty of Peru was divided, when the viceroyalty of New Granada was established with its capital in Bogotá. Decades later, in 1776, Buenos Aires became the seat of the viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata, freeing the southern reaches of South America from the distant authority of Lima. By bringing viceregal courts and bureaucracies closer to local populations, the Crown hoped to curb inefficiency, respond more swiftly to unrest, and fortify its defences against foreign rivals. Simultaneously, the Bourbons tightened trade laws to wrest revenues back from smugglers and colonial elites who had long exploited lax enforcement. The once rigid Seville-Cadiz monopoly gave way to a network of free ports. Yet each port was subject to stricter customs regimes overseen by royal intendentes. These officials standardized tariffs, dictated shipping schedules, and enforced the naval ordinances, which regulated the types of goods permitted and the authorized shipping lanes. Contraband networks collapsed under the new system of convoy protection and inland inspections conducted by mounted revenue officers. Even small coastal settlements felt the pinch as vessels carrying American hides, cacao, and textiles were now funneled through official channels, their cargoes catalogued and taxed before leaving port. But these reforms, designed to revive royal coffers, measured success in increased remittances to Madrid rather than local prosperity. Colonial merchants and landowners, once free to trade with Portuguese Brazil, Dutch Suriname, or the British Caribbean, found their networks severed. Textiles and tobacco that formerly slipped between islands now required expensive licenses. Local shipbuilders lost contracts as ships had to conform to standardized imperial designs. In Lima and Mexico City, former monopolists watched their privileges curtailed, and in Cadiz, powerful merchant guilds lost their grip on American trade. Worse, the Bourbon changes elevated Peninsular Spaniards, officials born in Spain, to positions that had traditionally belonged to the American-born Criollo elite. Viceroys, intendentes, and judges now arrived from Madrid at the Crown's behest, often with little familiarity with local languages or customs. They wielded broad powers to collect taxes, conscript soldiers, and reform judicial courts. The Criollos, educated in royal universities yet excluded from top offices, bristled at this perceived insult. They were deemed less trustworthy simply because they drew their first breath on colonial soil. As these tensions simmered, the economic burdens of Bourbon policies felt especially heavy on those who had once prospered under Habsburg rule. In the Rio de la Plata, as Buenos Aires merchants watched Asunción and Montevideo siphon off indigenous trade, they petitioned the viceroy for relief, only to be met with rigid insistence on quotas and excises. In Caracas, cacao planters saw diminished profits as Cadiz enforced stricter weight controls. Across the Andes, indigenous labor quotas under the meter system remained untouched by reform, even as rising export levies ate into miners and local communities' livelihoods. These crownward fiscal flows disrupted long-standing social contracts. Criollo elites had maintained colonial order through patronage networks and municipal councils. Their marginalization weakened those old alliances. Intellectual circles in Mexico City and Lima began to harbour Enlightenment ideas imported from France and Britain, calls for equality before the law, critiques of inherited privilege, and the notion that legitimate government derived from the consent of the governed. Secret salons gathered to discuss the writings of Montesquieu and Voltaire, and criollos questioned whether a distant monarch in Madrid truly represented their interests. By the late 18th century, this growing Creole resentment had assumed political form. In 1764, José de Galvez's visit to New Spain had already sparked protests when he recommended new taxes on wine and pulque. 20 years later, when the Bourbon King Charles III expelled the Jesuits, many criollos mourned the loss of the order's schools and missions that had nurtured local leadership. University rectorates in San Marcos and Salamanca debated whether the crown's right to tax and legislate had limits, a radical departure from earlier colonial orthodoxy. Moreover, the example of the newly independent United States, whose revolution began in 1776, the very same year the Rio de la Plata Viceroyalty was founded, inspired criollos to imagine a polity governed by Americans rather than Spaniards. Though Philadelphia lay thousands of miles away, printed pamphlets circulated in port cities and informed conversation in taverns and drawing rooms. The Bourbon reforms, so effective at boosting revenue and curbing smuggling, unwittingly created a colonial intelligentsia that saw itself as distinct, capable, and long denied full stake in the imperial system. Thus, while the Bourbons succeeded in reshaping Spain's new world into a more orderly and profitable dominion, they also fractured the very social bonds that had held empire together. The creation of new viceroyalties and the tightening of trade laws streamlined administration and funneled wealth back to the crown. Yet, in doing so, they alienated a rising class of criollos who would soon channel their resentment into calls for autonomy and ultimately independence. As Creole voices grew ever bolder, the empire stood on the brink of transformation. In the coming years, the convergence of fiscal pressure, ideological ferment, and external conflict would ignite the struggles that ended Spanish rule across the Americas. Enlightenment, science, and dissent. By the early 18th century, the currents of Enlightenment thought flowing out of Paris, London, and Amsterdam had begun to stir even the most remote corners of the Spanish Empire. In cabinet rooms at the Escorial and salons in Cadiz, Spanish nobles and ministers debated the merits of natural rights, the separation of powers, and the utility of scientific inquiry. Though intellectual life in Spain had long been dominated by scholastic theology and royal decree, a new generation of Spanish elites, inspired by Voltaire, Montesquieu, and Diderot, sought to reconcile reason with Roman Catholic tradition and to apply empirical methods to both governance and exploration. Among these forward-thinking nobles, Gaspar Melchor de Jovellanos stands out. As a member of the Council of Castile under Charles III, Jovellanos championed legal reform, arguing that laws should derive from social utility rather than unquestioned precedent. His essays on agriculture and education proposed land consolidation and technical schools to help Spain emerge from economic stagnation. Meanwhile, in Andalusian universities, professors began to lecture on Newtonian physics, introducing Spanish students to the laws of motion and gravitation, concepts that would later guide naval and astronomical studies at the Casa de Contratación in Seville. This intellectual ferment found a practical outlet in the mapping expeditions and scientific surveys organized throughout the empire. The Bourbon crown, keen to consolidate its territorial claims and enhance resource extraction, sponsored a series of grand voyages of discovery. In 1746, the Viceroy of Peru, José Antonio Manso de Velasco, commissioned the French geographer and engineer Louis Feuillet to chart the Pacific coasts of Chile and Peru, record magnetic variations, and collect specimens of unknown plants. Feuillet's meticulous charts, later published in Madrid, enabled more accurate navigation and laid the groundwork for botanical gardens back in Spain. Simultaneously, in the Viceroyalty of New Granada, the Spanish envoy and scientist José Celestino Mutis launched the famed botanical expedition of Bogotá in 1783. Over 4 decades, Mutis's team gathered thousands of plant specimens from the Andean highlands to the Amazon basin. Each specimen was carefully pressed, illustrated by artists trained in Europe, and classified according to Linnaean taxonomy. Mutis's reports, communicated to the Royal Botanical Garden in Madrid, enriched European knowledge of cinchona, the source of quinine, coca, and other medicinal flora. These surveys were not mere academic exercises. They aimed to identify resources, timber, dyes, medicinal plants that could enhance colonial wealth while advancing scientific understanding. Meanwhile, in New Spain, the Royal Botanical Garden of Mexico City opened in 1788 under the direction of Francisco Antonio Zea and Martín Cesé y la Casta. Both trained under Mutis's oversight in Bogotá, they conducted high-altitude surveys in the Sierra Madre, documenting precious woods, furs and minerals. Their Flora Mexicana would become a cornerstone of New World botany. At the same time, the vice-regal government commissioned geodesic surveys led by Manuel María de la Mota Padilla, whose triangulation networks mapped central Mexico with unprecedented precision. These maps proved invaluable for military planning, mining concessions, and the construction of roads and aqueducts. Such large-scale expeditions also carried an undercurrent of dissent. Creole scientists, those American-born descendants of Spaniards, often noted the Crown's failure to harness colonial talent. Many aspired to governorships and professorships, but found themselves passed over in favor of peninsular appointees. Creole intellectuals like Francisco Javier Alegre of Puebla wrote essays on natural history in which they subtly questioned the monopoly of the Casa de Contratación, proposing local academies to foster homegrown expertise. Their disenchantment found expression in clandestine manuscript societies, where translations of Rousseau's Social Contract and Smith's Wealth of Nations circulated among university students. By the late 1780s, this marriage of Enlightenment, ideals and empirical science had produced a colonial intelligentsia confident in its ability to govern and reform. The Chile-Patagonian expedition of Alessandro Malaspina, 1789–1794, for instance, combined geographic reconnaissance with ethnographic observation, treating indigenous peoples as subjects of study rather than mere obstacles to conquest. Malaspina's final report, suppressed by Madrid for fear of sedition, condemned the treatment of colonial subjects, and urged greater autonomy for local administrators. Thus, Spain's late colonial Enlightenment bridged monarchy and academy, bringing new methods to old problems. Intellectuals and scientists embraced empirical study not only to enrich museums and herbaria, but to advocate for legal, economic, and administrative reform. Yet the same currents that modernized cartography and botany also fostered dissent among Creoles, who chafed at exclusion from power and dreamed of a more just, rational order. As ideas of natural rights and national sovereignty took root, the empire found itself on the cusp of revolutionary change. Its own Enlightenment genius, a double-edged sword that would illuminate paths toward independence, even as it sought to strengthen royal authority. By the late 1760s, the spirit of reform that had enlivened Spain's courts and academies collided headlong with the entrenched power of the Church. The Jesuits, long guardians of education and missionary enterprise throughout Spanish America, had become both indispensable repositories of knowledge and focal points of suspicion. Accused of harboring political ambitions and shielding Creole elites from crown control, they faced the wrath of Charles III. In 1767, with a single royal decree, the Jesuits were expelled from all Spanish territories. Men who had run the universities at Lima and Mexico City, who had founded missions in Paraguay, and who had served as confessors to viceroys, were forced into exile. Their properties, colleges, orchards, printing presses, were seized by the crown, their schools closed overnight. Across the empire, students awoke to find former teachers gone. Indigenous communities saw the collapse of mission networks that had provided both spiritual guidance and practical instruction in agriculture and crafts. This expulsion sparked a crisis in church-state relations. The Bourbon monarchy asserted its regalist theory, arguing that the crown held ultimate authority even over ecclesiastical appointments and institutions. Bishops who protested were reminded that their salaries, benefices, and cathedrals depended on royal patronage. The once untouchable Society of Jesus, the Company of Jesus, whose vow-bound hierarchy reported only to the Pope, had been humbled by a secular government. The suppression reverberated from Cadiz to Manila, sending shockwaves through the global network of Jesuit missions. The replacements, secular clergy and members of other orders, such as the Dominicans and Franciscans, lacked the Jesuits' organizational zeal and intellectual training, leaving a vacuum in colonial education that would not be filled until the 19th century. In the aftermath, church-state tensions deepened. The Crown assumed control of seminaries and parishes, regulating sermons and scripture translations. In New Spain, the Archbishop's palace in Mexico City found itself overshadowed by the vice-regal palace, where intendants monitored every pastoral appointment. In Bogotá, newly empowered royal auditors enforced state decrees limiting church tithes and charitable endowments. Lay brotherhoods, hermandades, once sponsored by Jesuits, now petitioned the Crown directly for permission to hold processions or fund hospitals. The idea that civil authorities could intervene in matters of conscience was revolutionary and deeply unsettling to faithful Spaniards. At the same time, echoes of the American and French revolutions drifted across the Atlantic, carried by merchant ships, returning travelers, and smuggled pamphlets. While early Enlightenment reforms had encouraged scientific inquiry and more efficient governance, they also fostered political awareness among Creole elites who longed for a greater voice in their own affairs. In Buenos Aires, intellectual gatherings in private homes debated Locke's theories of government by consent. In Lima's mint, artisans whispered about natural rights as they struck silver pesos. In Caracas, a young lawyer named José María Morelos read Montesquieu between cases at the Real Audiencia, imagining a system of separated powers and local autonomy. These ideas percolated unevenly but persistently. Creole merchants in Cartagena quietly funded the printing of Thomas Paine's Common Sense, while planters in Puebla circulated translations of Beccaria's treatises on criminal justice. Spanish officials, though alarmed, found it impossible to stamp out every unauthorized book or secret meeting. Instead, they tightened censorship, deploying informants to report seditious conversation and issuing edicts against foreign publications. But repression only underscored the growing divide between metropolitan policy and colonial sentiment. Moreover, economic pressures, rising taxes to fund Bourbon wars in Europe, and new trade levies under the reforms exacerbated social tensions. Indigenous communities, still subject to labor drafts and head taxes, formed clandestine alliances to resist local abuses, sometimes invoking the language of recent decrees that had abolished Jesuit overreach. In Quito, Francisco de Leon Brewster organized informal clubs to discuss autonomy rights, while in Mexico City, artisans petitioned the viceroy for tax relief by citing the Enlightenment principle that government exists to promote the welfare of its people. By the eve of the 19th century, independence movements that had once seemed improbable began to flicker with new life. They were not yet full-fledged insurgencies. No banners inscribed Libertad fluttered over colonial plazas, but a network of local juntas, clandestine lodges, and provincial deputies who quietly conveyed their dissatisfaction to sympathetic sympathizers in Cadiz and Seville. The suppression of the Jesuits had taught colonists that the crown could upend institutions without warning. The Bourbon reforms had shown them that ostensibly beneficial changes could also serve imperial ends. And the spread of Enlightenment ideals gave them the vocabulary to articulate grievances, taxation without representation, the tyranny of distant authorities, and the right of peoples to self-rule. Thus, in the same moment that Spanish scientists charted the Andes and surveyed the coasts, a chorus of discontent began to swell among the empire's American-born elites. Enlightenment thinkers may have intended to strengthen the monarchy through reason and reform, but their ideas also ignited a desire for local agency. As church and state clashed, and as Creoles found common cause in the language of liberty, the foundations of Spain's American empire quietly cracked. In the next chapter, those cracks would widen into open rebellion as colonies everywhere seized the Enlightenment promise of sovereignty and set their sails for independence. Collapse, revolutions, and the end of empire. In the spring of 1808, as Madrid awoke to the pale light of dawn, the city found itself under the shadow of French cannons. Napoleon Bonaparte having first coerced the Spanish King Charles IV and his son Ferdinand VII into abdication at Bayonne, seized control of the Bourbon monarchy and installed his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne. What followed was not a smooth transfer of authority, but a sudden rupture in the fabric of imperial rule. Spaniards, both liberal and conservative, Catholic and enlightened, recoiled at the sight of French troops occupying plazas and requisitioning supplies. Across the peninsula, provincial leaders convened in hastily formed juntas, claiming to govern in Ferdinand's name and rallying resistance to the French usurpation. In Cadiz, the Old World held out defiantly behind fortifications, while in the mountains of Asturias and Galicia, guerrilla bands harried Marshal Ney's columns, cutting supply lines and ambushing detachments in the dense oak forests. This Peninsular War, brutal, drawn-out and devastating, sapped Spain's ability to project power across the Atlantic. The collapse of central authority in Madrid and Seville had profound consequences in the American viceroyalties. Across the Caribbean shore, colonial capitals such as Lima and Mexico City recognized the juntas in Spain as the only legitimate representatives of the absent king. Yet once the Spanish homeland descended into chaos, colonial elites came to a stark realization: the empire's center no longer held. When the Junta Suprema in Seville called for colonial deputies to travel to Spain to pledge loyalty to Ferdinand, local Creole assemblies seized the moment to assert their own authority. In Caracas, a gathering in April 1810 deposed the Spanish governor and established the Supreme Junta of Caracas. In Buenos Aires, the May Revolution of 1810 replaced the viceroy with a local governing board known as the Primera Junta. Far from mere echoes of Spanish events, these movements laid the groundwork for independent nationhood. What followed over the next 16 years was a sweeping series of wars of independence that would unravel 3 centuries of colonial rule. In Mexico, Father Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla rang the church bells of Dolores in September 1810, issuing his famous cry for liberty and equality. His insurgent army of indigenous peasants and mestizo artisans surged toward Mexico City, only to be crushed in 1811. Yet Hidalgo's martyrdom galvanized later leaders. José María Morelos, another cleric, reorganized the revolution into a disciplined campaign, drafting a constitution that envisioned land reform and citizenship rights. Though Morelos fell in 1815, the idea of Mexican self-government had taken root. By 1821, Royalist commander Agustín de Iturbide switched sides, forging an alliance with Creole elites to establish the first Mexican empire, with Iturbide declared emperor, though it too would soon give way to a republic. South of the equator, the Spanish stronghold of Lima faced rebellion from patriots in Quito and Buenos Aires. Simón Bolívar, the liberator, first intervened in northern South America in 1813, crossing the Andes to free Bogotá from Spanish control. His bold campaign in Venezuela, complemented by Francisco de Paula Santander's diplomatic skill, liberated New Granada by 1819. Bolívar envisioned a federation of republics, but struggled to forge unity among the newly freed lands. Meanwhile, In the southern cone, General José de San Martín led Argentine forces across the Andes into Chile in 1817, collaborating with local patriots to expel royalists at the Battle of Chacabuco. Thence, San Martin's navy transported troops to Peru, where the proclamation of independence in Lima in 1821 marked the beginning of Spain's final domino collapse in the Americas. Spain, preoccupied with restorative campaigns in Europe against Napoleon and coping with liberal uprisings in 1820–1823, found itself unable to dispatch large expeditionary forces to the New World. Its once mighty fleet was stationed in the Mediterranean or blockaded British ports. Heroes of the Peninsular War, Generals Murillo and Pezuela, offered stiff Spanish resistance in Venezuela and Peru, but even their veteran tercios were outmatched by the fervor of independence. By 1824, at the Battle of Ayacucho, Marshal Sucre, acting under Bolívar's command, delivered a decisive defeat, capturing the viceroy himself and extinguishing Spain's last organized army in South America. By 1826, only Cuba and Puerto Rico remained under Spanish rule. The empire on which the sun never sets had set at last over the mainland. The revolutionary decade had reshaped the hemisphere. Mexico, Gran Colombia, Peru, Chile, Argentina, and others emerged as sovereign republics, each navigating the tensions between liberal constitutions and oligarchic traditions. Spain retreated into the Atlantic, clinging to its final islands until 1898. But the collapse of colonial authority between 1810 and 1826 marked more than the loss of territory. It signaled the end of an age in which monarchy, church, and imperial commerce had intertwined to sustain a global empire. In that collapse lay the paradox of history. The Enlightenment ideas that had modernized Spain's institutions also empowered Creole elites to claim self-rule, and the Napoleonic shock that convulsed Europe provided the opening that independence movements had long awaited. As Spain turned inward to reconstruct its own government, the newly born nations of Latin America began their own journeys, fraught with promise and peril, out of the shadow of empire and into the bright, uncertain dawn of republican sovereignty. By 1826, the once vast Spanish Empire in the Americas had all but vanished. The vibrant silver cities of Mexico, the sprawling estates of Peru, and the tropical ports of Venezuela and New Granada now flew newly minted national flags rather than fading red and gold banners of Spain. In little more than a generation, Spain had watched its continental dominions slip away through a mosaic of revolutionary struggles. The loss of Mexico, South America, and most colonies marked the end of an imperial era, forcing Spain to confront the reality that her global reach had retracted to a few scattered outposts: Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Loss of Mexico, South America, and most colonies. Mexico's rupture came with both drama and irony. Miguel Hidalgo's peasant uprising in 1810 had been suppressed, and José María Morelos's idealistic campaigns had faltered, yet Creole leadership, embodied by Agustín de Iturbide, capitalized on royal weakness after Ferdinand VII's abdication. Iturbide's alliance with Vicente Guerrero in 1821 crystallized into the Plan of Iguala, proclaiming Mexican independence under a constitutional monarchy. When Spanish officers in Veracruz refused to fight citizens who once claimed Spanish subjecthood, Mexico's liberation became inevitable. By September 27, 1821, Spanish colonial rule in mainland North America formally ended, after 3 centuries and enormous human cost. South America's liberation followed parallel yet distinct paths. In New Granada, Simón Bolívar's daring, admirable campaign of 1813–14 and José Antonio Páez's operations in Venezuela led to the declaration of Gran Colombia in 1819, encompassing modern Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, and Panama. While internal divisions fractured Bolívar's vision, the Republic's creation signaled Spain's permanent loss of its northern Andean holdings. Uruguay's insurgencies and Brazil's simultaneous assertion of independence set the southern stage for Argentine, Chilean, and Peruvian revolutions. Here, José de San Martin's crossing of the Andes in 1817 and his liberation of Santiago, followed by the proclamation of Peruvian independence in 1821, extinguished Spanish authority across the southern cone. The decisive Battle of Ayacucho in 1824, led by Antonio José de Sucre, forced the capitulation of the last viceroys, extinguishing Spanish military presence on the continent. Across Central America, federations briefly emerged to fill the void. The Federal Republic of Central America, 1823–1841, bound together Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica before fragmenting into individual states. In the Caribbean, islands like Santo Domingo revolted but were reconquered briefly by Spain, only to join Haiti or proclaim their own republics in the 1840s. With the mainland lost, Spanish America receded to 2 great island possessions, Cuba and Puerto Rico, and the distant archipelago of the Philippines, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Remain unlike the frenetic wars on the mainland. Spain's remaining colonies experienced a slower, more contested decline. Cuba, the empire's sugar crown jewel, remained loyal through the independence wars, but became ever more restless as Creole planters demanded political reforms. Slavery persisted, underpinning the sugar-based economy, yet abolitionist ideas rippled through plantation society. The Spanish government granted limited representation in the Cortés, Parliament, in the 1860s, but calls for autonomy grew louder in Havana's intellectual circles. Havana's wealth shielded it temporarily from the furies that had engulfed Mexico and Peru, but the colony's strategic location made it a prized target for rival powers and a crucible for revolutionary conspiracies. Puerto Rico's trajectory mirrored Cuba's, though on a smaller scale. The island's rural economy, coffee, sugar, tobacco, depended on enslaved labor until emancipation in 1873. Political reform movements, inspired by events in Cuba and Spain's own liberal convulsions of 1868–1874, the Sexenio Democrático, pressed for a degree of self-government. Intellectuals such as Luis Muñoz Rivera and Román Valdoriotti de Castro founded newspapers advocating for greater autonomy. While loyalists celebrated Spanish patriotism, autonomy activists argued that only local control could address island conditions. Puerto Rico thus became a laboratory for colonial reform, ultimately too little to stem the tide of imperial dissolution. Half a world away in the Philippines, Spanish rule dated back to 1565, but had always been tenuous, with intermittent revolts by Muslim communities in the south and discontent among Christianized provinces in Luzon and the Visayas. Manila, the hub of the galleon trade with Acapulco, had served as a vibrant cultural crossroads. Yet Spanish authorities maintained strict control through missionary orders and the Guardia Civil. The late 19th century saw the emergence of reformist movements led by the Ilustrados, educated Filipinos like José Rizal and Marcelo H. del Pilar, who published nationalist tracts demanding representation in the Cortés and secularization of parishes. Their exposure to liberal ideas in Europe and America made them impatient with colonial stagnation. Despite these stirrings, Spain retained firm military control over these remaining colonies until imperial overreach and New World conflicts tested her grip. The growing discontent in Cuba and the Philippines would not boil over until the closing years of the century. For now they stood as Spain's final imperial footholds, islands where Spanish language, Catholic rituals, and colonial institutions still shaped daily life. By mid-century, Spain's empire had contracted from the continental mainland to scattered islands whose fates were deeply entangled with the strategic ambitions of other great powers. Cuba and Puerto Rico, straining under the weight of sugar's boom and bust economy and yearning for political reform, and the Philippines, awakening to the stirrings of nationalism, represented both the last embers of a global empire and the early flames of modern nationhood. Though Spain's sun would never set over the American mainland again, it continued to cast a long, flickering glow over these distant shores, glow that would ignite new struggles in the decades to come. As the 19th century drew to a close, Spain's once vast empire had been pared back to a handful of overseas territories, most notably Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. Yet these islands, far from settling into peaceful colonial backwaters, became crucibles of resistance, reform, and ultimately armed rebellion. Spain's attempts to reassert control revealed the deep fissures in its late imperial structure and set the stage for the final collapse of its global dominion in 1898. In Cuba, the sugar economy dominated politics and society. Wealthy planters profited handsomely from global demand, yet the island's black and mixed-race laborers endured harsh working conditions and limited rights. The first major uprising, the 10 Years' War, 1868-1878, had been brutally suppressed, but achieved modest reforms, the abolition of slavery in 1886 and concessions in electoral law that allowed limited Creole participation in governance. Yet these measures failed to satisfy a growing nationalist movement led by charismatic figures such as José Martí, who returned from exile in 1892 to found the Partido Revolucionario Cubano. Martí canvassed the countryside, delivering fiery speeches exhorting Cuban unity across racial and class lines, emphasizing that independence was the only remedy for colonial injustice. By the mid-1890s, sporadic uprisings coalesced into the War of Independence, 1895-1898. Martí fell in battle in 1895, martyring himself for the cause, but his ideas animated a new generation of leaders. Máximo Gómez, a Dominican-born general experienced in guerrilla tactics, organized cavalry raids that crippled sugar plantations and disrupted railway lines. Antonio Macheo, known as the Bronze Titan, won legendary victories in the eastern provinces, inspiring black and mulatto Cubans with his martial prowess. Spain responded with a brutal reconcentration policy under General Valeriano Weyler, forcibly relocating rural Cubans into guarded camps to deprive rebels of food and recruits. Villages emptied, disease spread, and civilian death tolls soared. Weyler's tactics, labeled Reconquista, drew international condemnation, particularly in the United States, where yellow journalism sensationalized Cuban suffering. Meanwhile, across the Pacific in the Philippines, a parallel struggle for autonomy found its voice in the propaganda movement of the 1880s. Educated ilustrados José Rizal, Graciano López Jaena, and Marcelo del Pilar published newspapers in Madrid and Barcelona demanding restitution of Philippine civil rights, representation in the Spanish Cortés, and secularization of the clergy. Their peaceful petitions went largely unanswered. Spanish authorities responded by imprisoning or expelling activists. When Rizal returned home in 1892, he founded the Reform Society La Liga Filipina, only to be arrested, tried, and executed in 1896. His execution galvanized Andres Bonifacio, a Manila clerk who led the Katipunan, a secret society that launched armed revolt against Spanish rule later that same year. The Philippine Revolution, 1896-1898, saw rapid rebel successes in outlying provinces, though Spanish forces held Manila within their fortified Intramuros quarter. Intriguingly, the Cuban and Filipino wars became intertwined in global geopolitics. The United States, concerned over investments in Cuban sugar, public sentiment stirred by Spanish atrocities, and ambitions for overseas markets, watched events closely. When the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor in February 1898, an incident still debated by historians, the U.S. declared war on Spain in April, citing Cuban intervention as its casus belli, but eyeing imperial expansion. The resulting Spanish-American war was brief but decisive. American naval forces under Commodore George Dewey steamed into Manila Bay on May 1, 1898, routing the aging Spanish squadron under Admiral Patricio Montojo. Simultaneously, U.S. troops landed in Cuba, supporting Cuban insurgents in battles such as Santiago de Cuba and San Juan Hill, where Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders won fame. Spain, already strained by years of colonial counterinsurgency, could muster neither fleet nor army adequate to resist. By August, an armistice halted hostilities. The Treaty of Paris, December 1898, formalized Spain's imperial eclipse. Spain relinquished sovereignty over Cuba, though the island became a U.S. protectorate until 1902, ceded Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States, and sold the Philippines for $20 million. Spain's final vestiges of empire, some garrison outposts in Morocco and economic interests in Western Sahara, remained. But the proud red and gold standard no longer flew beyond Europe's borders. For Spaniards, the loss was traumatic. The empire that had endured for 4 centuries and spanned oceans was gone in a moment. The disaster of '98, as it became known, prompted national introspection. Writers of the generation of '98, such as Miguel de Unamuno, lamented Spain's decline and urged cultural and political regeneration. Military and political leaders debated the need for constitutional reform, revitalized education and economic modernization, sparking the seeds of Spain's 20th century transformation. In the Caribbean and Pacific, newly liberated nations faced their own trials. Cubans and Filipinos who had fought for independence found themselves under U.S. control, leading to further conflicts. The Philippine-American War, 1899–1902, and nationalist stirrings in Dissent, Cuba and Puerto Rico, yet the Spanish Empire's end in 1898 marked a definitive close to the age of European overseas dominion in the Americas and the Pacific. Chapter 11's story of Spain's final imperial days captures both the empire's last flickers of authority and the inexorable rise of new powers. Amid repression and rebellion, Spain's last colonies became theaters of modern guerrilla warfare, international diplomacy, and nascent nationalism. As the 19th century ended, the sun, once believed never to set on Spanish domains, finally dipped below the horizon, ushering Spain into a new era defined not by conquest, but by reconstruction, memory, and the enduring legacies of cross-cultural encounter. In the crisp December air of 1898, diplomats gathered in a grand Parisian chamber to sign the Treaty of Paris, formally marking the end of Spain's centuries-long empire. The once mighty Spanish crown, ruler of a globe-spanning dominion from the silver mines of Potosi to the tropical plantations of the Caribbean, now faced the stark reality of geopolitical retreat. Under the treaty's terms, Spain relinquished sovereignty over Cuba, ceded Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States, and transferred the Philippines in exchange for $20 million. This settlement transformed Spain overnight from imperial overlord to European nation-state, its monarch no longer king of Indies and oceans, but simply king of Spain. The treaty's emotional impact resonated deeply in Madrid's boulevards and cafes. Newspaper headlines proclaimed El Desastre, the disaster of '98, while public intellectuals lamented the sudden contraction of national pride. The crisis gave birth to the generation of '98 writers and thinkers, Miguel de Unamuno, Pío Baroja, Antonio Machado, who sought to reckon with Spain's diminished stature and to rediscover the country's cultural soul. Universities added modern literature and social critique to their curricula, while political salons debated whether parliamentary reform or economic modernization offered Spain the best path forward. Though the Americas and the Pacific had slipped, beyond Spanish rule, Madrid still clung to small outposts along the African, Atlantic and Mediterranean coasts, remnants of an earlier era of conquest. The Spanish protectorate in Morocco, established in 1912 under international mandate, extended Spain's influence over the Rif Mountains and the fertile plains of northern Morocco. Here, Spanish administrators managed agricultural estates and mining concessions, building railways deep into hinterlands once ruled by the Berber sultans. Yet the Rif region resisted. In the 1920s, Berber leader Abd el-Krim united mountain tribes into the Republic of the Rif, defeating Spanish forces at Ao annual in 1921 and forcing a humiliating retreat. Only with French cooperation and heavy artillery did Madrid reassert control by 1926, underscoring the costs of imperial ambition even on a reduced scale. Further south, Spain maintained authority over Spanish Sahara, today's Western Sahara, after the 1884-85 Berlin Conference had partitioned Africa among European powers. Spanish administrators oversaw coastal outposts like El Aaiún and Villa Cisneros, controlling phosphate mines and regulating trans-Saharan camel caravans. They enforced an indirect rule system, recognizing local tribal sheikhs while imposing tax levies and Spanish legal codes. Nomadic Sahrawis, accustomed to centuries-old patterns of mobility, chafed under colonial boundaries and regulations, leading to sporadic rebellions in the 1940s and 1950s that the Spanish military suppressed with aerial bombardment and mobile troops. By mid-20th century, global winds of decolonization had swept through Africa and Asia. Morocco achieved independence from France and Spain in 1956, leaving only the diminutive enclave of Ceuta and Melilla, cities on the Moroccan coast still under Spanish sovereignty. These enclaves, rich in fishing waters and strategically located at the Mediterranean entrance, became symbols of Spain's residual imperial footprint. Meanwhile, Western Sahara's status became increasingly contested. In 1975, amid the twilight of the Franco regime, Morocco and Mauritania partitioned the territory, though the indigenous Polisario Front continued to press for Sahrawi self-determination. Spain's withdrawal, officially completed in 1976, left a chasm of unresolved sovereignty that still echoes in international forums. In these last colonial theatres, Spain's imperial transformation reflected a broader 20th century shift, from direct colonial rule to economic, cultural, and diplomatic influence. Fishing agreements, mining contracts, and tourism development in the Canary Islands, Spain's Atlantic archipelago, served as new mechanisms of engagement with neighboring African states. Spanish language and law, Christian traditions, and architectural styles interwove with local cultures, creating layered legacies that bridged continents even after formal sovereignty ended. Today, Spain is a parliamentary democracy, its king a constitutional figurehead. Yet the country's colonial past continues to inform its identity and international relations. Spain is the only European nation whose language, religion, and legal systems extend across multiple continents. It shares deep linguistic and cultural ties with Latin America, maintains complex arrangements in North Africa, and participates in multilateral bodies that address decolonization and human rights. The final chapters of Spain's imperial story, marked by the Treaty of Paris and the last colonial struggles in Morocco and Western Sahara, remind us that empires wane not only through military defeat, but through the inexorable rise of nationalism, the quest for self-determination, and the transformation of global power structures. As Spain navigates the 21st century, its imperial past remains an enduring echo, shaping debates over identity, memory, and the nature of freedom. The legacy of the Spanish Empire. Across the breadth of Latin America, the Spanish Empire has left an indelible imprint that endures in language, religion, and culture. From the snow-capped peaks of the Andes to the tropical lowlands of the Amazon, Spanish is the common tongue in 20 nations, binding diverse peoples, indigenous, African, European, and Asian, into shared conversation. This linguistic unity facilitates modern governance, commerce, and regional integration, yet it also conceals an incredible tapestry of local dialects. In Mexico, the rolling cadence of Mexican Spanish mingles with Nahuatl words for tomatoes, chocolate, and chocolates, spiritual essence. In Peru and Bolivia, Quechua and Aymara phrases pepper everyday speech. Llamas, chicha, or ayahuasca retain their indigenous resonance even as sentences flow in Castilian grammar. In the southern cone, the voseo of Argentina and Uruguay, addressing friends with vos instead of tu, harks back to colonial-era usage preserved on the farthest frontier. Through Spanish, communities thousands of miles apart share literature, journalism, and the lyrics of regional music, creating a hemispheric conversation that transcends borders. Religion, too, binds Latin America's cultural fabric. The Catholic Church, brought by mendicant friars and mission builders, shaped public life from the earliest days of conquest. Baroque cathedrals rise in every cathedral town. The grand facade of Mexico City's Metropolitan Cathedral echoes Spanish design, while the red stone arches of Quito's Church of San Francisco speak to a fusion of European and Andean aesthetics. Sunday masses, processions during Holy Week, and patron saint festivals animate village squares with incense, music, and communal feasts. Yet beneath these shared rituals lies a deeper syncretism. In rural Guatemala, Maya communities honor Maximon, a folk saint blending St. Simon with ancient maize deities. In Brazil's Amazon, Catholic saints stand alongside shamans who invoke river spirits during healing ceremonies. These blended practices reflect centuries of negotiation. Indigenous beliefs adapted Catholic symbols, just as African traditions survived beneath the veneer of Christian worship. The result is a richly layered spiritual landscape where faith communities draw from multiple ancestries to find meaning and solace. Cultural expressions of music, dance, and cuisine likewise showcase Spain's legacy interwoven with local flavors. Flamenco's passionate guitar strains found new life in Argentina's tango, still infused with Andalusian rhythms, yet echoed in the urban milongas of Buenos Aires. Mexican mariachi bands, adorned in charro outfits, reinterpret Spanish folk songs on violins and trumpets, while Brazil's samba borrows Iberian melodies over African polyrhythms in vibrant carnival pageantry. In the kitchen, tortillas, tamales, and pupusas trace their roots to pre-Columbian agriculture. Still, the introduction of wheat flour gave rise to arepa de trigo and pan dulce, bridging Spanish baking traditions with native maize-based staples. Chili peppers, originally American, spread back to Spain and returned as ají verde in Peruvian ceviche, a culinary circle that exemplifies how ingredients and recipes journeyed both ways across the Atlantic. Yet the Spanish Empire's legacy is not without its darker contours, and modern scholarship grapples with the debate over colonial violence versus cultural exchange. The conquest of Tenochtitlan and the fall of Cusco remain symbols of imperial ruthlessness, cities razed, temples destroyed, and entire social orders dismantled by smallpox and steel. Encomienda labor systems subjected millions to forced work in mines and plantations. The Inquisition, though less severe in the Americas than in Europe, nonetheless persecuted indigenous spiritual leaders and Creole elites for heresy. Critics argue that these atrocities cast a long shadow, fracturing societies and embedding structural inequalities whose after-effects persist in land distribution, racial hierarchies, and patterns of poverty. At the same time, defenders of the colonial era emphasize instances of genuine cultural exchange, mestizo innovations, shared religious devotions, and new social structures that blended European and native law. In legal codes, such as the Recopilación de las Leyes de los Reinos de las Indias, the Crown attempted, if imperfectly, to protect indigenous communities from outright exploitation. Mission schools educated both boys and girls in literacy, agriculture, and craft skills, creating early centers of learning on the frontier. Likewise, colonial cities became crucibles of innovation, where artisans and intellectuals of mixed heritage developed legal systems, civic institutions, and urban planning designs that informed modern nation-building. Contemporary Latin American societies continue to negotiate this dual heritage. Memorials and museums commemorate indigenous resistance and martyrs of colonialism. Simultaneously, festivals celebrate the convergence of traditions. UNESCO-recognized Carnival in Oruro, Bolivia, epitomizes Andean and Catholic rites fused into a towering spectacle. Reconciliation initiatives, such as constitutional recognition of indigenous rights and bilingual education, seek to address past injustices while preserving cultural diversity. Scholars and activists dialogue across disciplines, acknowledging that the Spanish Empire's imprint is neither wholly condemnable nor wholly admirable, but a complex legacy requiring nuanced understanding. Ultimately, the Spanish Empire's enduring imprint on Latin America is one of profound transformation. Language, faith, and culture echo Iberian origins, yet they have been reshaped, reinterpreted, and revitalized by indigenous, African, and immigrant voices. The enduring debate over violence and exchange underscores that empire wrought sorrow and opportunity in equal measure. In the cities and villages of Latin America today, every plaza, church, and family gathers the threads of this shared history into a living tapestry, one that continues to evolve, reminding us that human societies are both conquerors and creators, bearers of both ruin and renewal. Centuries after the Spanish flag first unfurled over New World horizons, the bonds between Spain and its former colonies have evolved from imperial command to diplomatic partnership, cultural exchange, and complex interdependence. Across the Atlantic, modern Spain maintains robust ties with Latin American nations through language, trade agreements, and multilateral institutions such as the Ibero-American Summit, where heads of government convene annually to coordinate economic policy, cultural programs, and educational exchange. Spanish companies, from energy giants like Repsol to telecommunications networks such as Telefónica, invest heavily in Mexico, Colombia, and Argentina, while Latin American multinationals forge partnerships in Spain, creating a transatlantic economic corridor that unites Madrid with Mexico City, Buenos Aires, and Bogotá. These commercial links are undergirded by shared legal traditions. Civil codes in many Latin American countries remain rooted in Spain's Código Civil of the 19th century, guiding everything from property rights to family law. Beyond commerce, the bond of Hispanidad, the community of Spanish-speaking peoples, finds expression in education and cultural exchange. Each year, thousands of Latin American students enroll in Spanish universities, drawn by historic campuses in Salamanca and Barcelona, scholarship programs like Erasmus Plus, and the chance to study alongside peers from across Europe. Likewise, Spanish art troupes, literary festivals, and film retrospectives tour Latin American capitals. Cervantes institutes, cultural centers, akin to France's Alliance Française, promote Spanish language and literature in Rio de Janeiro, Havana, and Santiago de Chile. In the press, newspapers such as El País maintain editions for Latin American audiences, treating regional politics and social trends as intimately connected to those in Spain's own Basque country or Andalusia. Diplomacy also carries the weight of history. Spanish foreign ministers have repeatedly navigated delicate questions, truth commissions into past human rights abuses, educational reforms that re-examine textbooks' portrayal of conquest, and calls for official apologies for colonial-era atrocities. While some Latin American politicians view such gestures as overdue reckonings, others caution against presentism, arguing that they obscure more recent patterns of cooperation and solidarity. These debates play out in parliamentary sessions and academic conferences, reflecting a shared desire to come to terms with the past, without severing ties that now sustain millions of migrants, tourists, and entrepreneurs. Indeed, migration epitomizes ongoing connections. Since the 1950s, hundreds of thousands of Spaniards emigrated to Argentina, Venezuela, and Mexico, seeking opportunity amid post-Civil War austerity. In turn, from the 1990s onward, economic growth in Spain attracted Latin American migrants, Dominicans, Colombians, Ecuadorians, and Peruvians, who reshaped Spanish society with new foods, music, and social customs. The streets of Madrid and Barcelona now resound with Spanish, interspersed with Quechua greetings, Caribbean rhythms, and the aroma of arepas and empanadas. Second-generation Latin Americans in Spain straddle dual identities, citizens of both, their family's heritage country and their birth nation, forging a new pluralistic Hispanidad that transcends colonial legacies. Perhaps most profoundly, the enduring echoes of Spain's global empire resonate in our collective imagination. Monuments and museums, literature and film, scholarly debates and popular memory. UNESCO World Heritage Sites, from Mexico's historic center to Peru's monumental Machu Picchu, though pre-Hispanic, bear layers of colonial architecture and Christian iconography juxtaposed with ancient stonework. In Latin American literature, Gabriel Garcia Marquez's novels weave Spanish colonial family sagas into magical realist tapestries, while Spanish authors like Javier Marías explore the moral complexities of empire and memory. On screens worldwide, films such as The Mission and even The Rain reflect on Jesuit missions and the price of cultural conquest, reminding viewers that colonial histories continue to inform modern struggles over water rights, indigenous autonomy, and cultural heritage. In academic circles, Scholars draw on archives in Seville and Mexico City to revisit the empire's archives, ship logs in Cadiz, correspondence in Lima's viceregal palace, and judicial records in Manila's colonial tribunal. These studies reveal networks of exchange, silver shipped to China for silk, Mesoamerican maize reaching European tables, Filipino indigo finding its way into Mexican textiles, underscoring that empire was as much a web of intercontinental commerce as a system of coercion. Finally, tourism itself embodies a living legacy. Millions travel annually to Spain to stroll the Alhambra's gardens, wander Granada's Moorish palaces, or sip wine under Seville's orange trees. Simultaneously, Spaniards flock to Mexico's Yucatan, ruins, Peru's Andean terraces, and Cuba's colonial plazas, retracing centuries-old voyages and pilgrimages. In standing before those ancient stones and sunlit courtyards, visitors encounter the tangible traces of history and the paradox that an empire once built on conquest now thrives through curiosity, respect, and shared humanity. The Spanish Empire's story, once told in the language of sword and cross, now continues in the softer dialects of dialogue, remembrance, and mutual exchange. From treaty rooms in Paris to student dormitories in Madrid, from coastal plantations of the Caribbean to corporate boardrooms in Barcelona, the empire's echoes endure wherever people speak Spanish, celebrate syncretic faith, or negotiate the intertwined legacies of conquest and collaboration. Though the empire itself has vanished, its imprints, visible in law, language, and living culture, remind us that history's tides may recede, but their wave marks remain, shaping shores long after the water has moved on.